Fate, Souls and Singularities Chapter 141 to 143. Chapter 141, Heading Off to a Peaceful Nap. Stahl tightened their grip around Olga without causing her pain, their large axe swinging into the tree and crushing the bark beneath the blade to secure their hold. The berserker leaned forwards, covering Olga with their body and protecting her from the falling debris as the tree was violently shunted at an angle. Branches snapped, wood was rendered and splinters flew from the sudden appearance of the fortress. Even now, it was still rising higher and higher into the sky without any sign of stopping any time soon. That had been the plan though, try and delay King Arthur for as long as possible so they could clear away the fodder and attack her with a numbers advantage. At least Tarkus had played to his side of the plan. Marie being there was something she hadn't expected, but Olga didn't really know where to put the rider in the first place. That aside, she would only have wished that Tarkus could have gotten some more distance before triggering his noble phantasm. Romani, Olga snapped out above the chaos around her. Report. Readings from Sigurd are looking good. The man informed her, only using the audio to avoid distracting the woman. He should be done with his dragon soon. Gordon's readings were crippled with that blast earlier. The dragon struck him with a mana burst, and at this point, I think a lucky wyvern might be able to damage his spirit core. The readings are fluctuating, so he's probably using some spells. Cu and Brynhildr are consistent against a call, and Tarkus' noble phantasm has completely enshrouded himself, Marie and the presumed King Arthur. Olga grit her teeth. It was good enough news, but it could have been better. Antorin, Not great. Of course it isn't, she growled. Whether it was to herself or Romani, she couldn't tell, but she didn't care all that much right now. That stupid halfwit. She shook her head. Alright, fine. As long as Tarkus keeps King Arthur busy for the time being, then we can hopefully. What the? Romani exclaimed, his voice shifting into full-blown panic a second later, mana readings skyrocketing. Director, it's a noble phantasm coming from inside Tarkus' fortress. Olga widened her eyes. What? She exclaimed, but King Arthur is a lancer, they shouldn't have access to Excalibur in that form. She paled a second later. Rongomyniad, the spear of King Arthur. She'd overlooked it. Why had she not thought of the implications? A divine construct that was said to rival Excalibur, meaning that it was also classed as anti-fortress. Her eyes snapped onto the citadel next to them. Her heart probably stopped as she realized the full weight of the implications. She'd trapped them inside a fortress, with a servant whose noble phantasm would be anti-fortress. The outer wall of the fortress was ripped apart in a split second. An explosion of crimson light tore its way free of the structure and rushed towards them. The blood-red flames charged from the inner sanctum, flooding through every opening and crevice of the noble phantasm and tearing it asunder as it did so. The shockwave struck them a second later. The central trunk of the tree was pulled apart in the blast. Splinter chunks taller than a man were flung across the battlefield in seconds as the black mushroom cloud soared high into the sky. As for Olga herself, she barely managed to let out a scream before both her and Stahl were ripped from their spot on the tree and sent spiraling through the air. The berserker dissipated the axe and brought forth its circular shield. Pulling the director in close, as per her orders, the servant held out the shield in front of themselves to take the brunt of the impact. In spite of the explosion directly next to them and their battlefield falling out beneath their feet, neither Torin nor Calamate gave much notice to the fact the tree was rapidly falling over. The pair of them still engaged in their own duel as the black dragon raced towards the druid, leaping across the branches as he pursued him. Calamate swept his sword up. Torin leaned back to avoid the strike as the shockwave produced by the swing shattered the branches just above the pair of them. The howl of the explosion and the brightness of the flames illuminated the both of them against the dark backdrop of the night sky. Their fierce expressions revealed to one another in full. Torin kicked off the branch, throwing himself backwards and into the fall alongside the tree itself. Calamate threw himself after the druid with reckless abandon, raising his sword above his head as he did so in preparation for landing a strike against the man. Then the man thrust his arms forward. Even as the tree burned and died, it would still answer the call of its master. The branches snaked forwards and wrapped around Calamate's right angle, securing him in its grasp and temporarily halting the dragon's momentum in the fall. Twisting his body, Calamate made to swing back at his trapper, though before he had the chance to, the branch whipped him through the air and cracked him downwards. The force proved too much for the wooden limb as it ripped itself open with the sudden movement, though it fulfilled its aim. Calamate rocketed towards the ground at speeds which exceeded Torin's, smashing into the snow in a cloud of ice and mud. Calamate growled, then looked up and widened his eyes as he watched the top half of the falling tree racing towards him, its shadow casting itself over him. The dragon snarled and threw up his hands in a blocking motion in front of himself as the tree landed atop him. The tree crashed into him, crushing him under its body and blasting away the surrounding land. Torin landed in a roll, the servant twisting around as he slid to a halt and whirled in the direction where Calamate should have been lying beneath the tree. A pillar of yellow flames ripped through the wood, spinning around high into the sky like a tornado as it shattered the remaining branches and lifted their burning remains into the air along with the force of the jet engine. Calamate's body came racing out of the inferno a second later, honing in on Torin and closing the gap on him with a single powerful jump. A flash of yellow appeared in his hands as he brought out another sword, sweeping it forwards and throwing up a wave of snow directly into the face of the druid. Torin snarled at the trick, already ducking down and watching as the blade itself swept through the air above his head. He stepped forwards and swung up, cleaving through the icy cloud. And nothing else. The knight's eyes widened as he came to realize that the sword which had swept through the air above his head had not been swung, rather it had been thrown by the dragon who was nowhere to be seen. His body froze solid as the alien sensation assaulted him again. He caught a flash of movement in the corner of his eye and then felt his entire body cave to the side. Calamate's armored knuckles buried themselves into his ribs and shattered them instantly. A wet cough ripped its way past Torin's teeth as he was hurled into the air with the punch. As the druid flew skywards, Calamate beat his wings a single time in an effort to catch up with him, also succeeding in the outcome as he appeared above the druid. His mystic eye flashed once more and Torin felt his body overwhelmed by the sense of fatigue once again. Calamate brought his arms above his head, his fingers interlocked with one another into a single fist. Then he engulfed it in bright yellow flames before he swung his arms down like a hammer aimed directly towards the chest of the caster. Torin twisted his body, even as the eye was fixed upon him, in order to bring up the head of his axe at the last possible second. The joint fists of Calamate struck the flat side of the weapon and forced it into his chest, rocketing him towards the ground with a sudden acceleration. Torin released a pained grunt as he was rather violently reacquainted with the ground. Ha! He threw himself to the side. Calamate smashed into the floor where he had been moments prior. His fist punched through the ground up to his elbow. The dragon whirled on the druid, his eye flashed for a brief moment and held the man in place once more. Calamate pulled his arm up in a sweeping motion, unleashing a burst of flames from his palm as he did so and throwing up a cloud of fire, accompanied by charred and burning lumps of rock, directly into the face of Torin. The force of the explosion threw Torin away, his body rolling across the snow before sliding to a halt. Flaming debris still rained down around him as Calamate picked himself up from his crouched position and stared down at the druid from the distance between the two of them. What I do not understand is why you fight me alone. The dragon could not help but ask, if you fought me with your allies, it would have been an even fight. The clear confusion was present in the dragon's tone of voice, so, why are they not? He trailed off, his confusion fading away and his posture soon tightening with understanding. Surely you did not abandon them for the sake of revenge. There was a slight edge in the voice of the dragon. Did the bonds of your allies mean nothing to? Shut up, Torin growled out, raising his head up and glaring at the berserker. What do you know of bonds? He croaked out, already on his hands and knees and ignoring the hideous burn across the front of his armor that had melted all the way to his skin. A beast who destroys for the thrill of it. Don't talk as though you know me. Calamate snapped. You have never spoken with me before this moment, and when last I saw your people, I was a lesser being. The me who burnt down the grove and the me who stands before you now are now, quite literally, worlds apart. He stabbed a finger at the druid. Judge me by my acts now. You're still a monster who burns down homes, Torin spat back. You just now cloak yourself in the belief it is for a higher cause. It is for a cause. Calamate growled out, thumping a fist against his chest. The cause of my people and for them. For the future they will one day see, I shall do whatever I can to ensure its survival. Even if it means sacrificing mankind, then I shall do just that for them. Red eyes narrowed. And they stand by me. If my goal is so shallow, then where are those who stand by you? Torin snarled at the dragon, scrambling back to his feet and rushing forwards, grabbing his axe off the floor as he did so and rushing the dragon. Calamate stood firm, raising his own sword up and swinging it down towards the druid. Alsana rose her hand up once more, spiked pillars of ice rose up from the ground in a line that snaked directly towards the one-eyed dragon. The mountainous beast snorted, dark smoke puffing out from its nostrils before opening up its maw and unleashing a torrent of flames from the back of its throat. The burning river flooded the ground, melting away Alsana's attack with ease and blanketing the land in fire, already closing in on both herself and Lud. The woman widened her eyes slightly before sweeping her hands upwards. A flat-topped wall of ice pulled itself from the ground directly in front of her, the flames crashed into it and swept around, the wall hissed and steamed as the extreme temperatures combated against one another for dominance. Slowly but surely, the dragon was proving the clear victor in that struggle. The face of the wall that Alsana was audience to started to bubble away, bright orange rays of light puncturing through her defenses as the flames gored through the ice. The woman's face started to become taut with strain as she worked to hasten her summoning of the barrier. The situation was made all the harder as the dragon started to take powerful steps forwards, each movement shook the earth with the tremendous weight of the beast. The rumbling drew louder and louder, each methodical step sent another tremble through Alsana's bones. She might do the role well enough as defender, but she was no warrior, and that much should have been obvious to anyone whom she ever spoke with. It had never been expected of her to fight in the first place, therefore she relied on her support to do that. With a mental call, she alerted Zalan to her predicament. While she was certain her companion was protecting the humans as best as he could, it didn't change the fact that they would disappear if she vanished. It was a moot point, either way the humans would lose one of their defenders. Besides, in the chaos of the explosion moments earlier, she was sure the wyverns would be in a similar state of chaos. There was a deafening crunch a moment later, the flames were cut out and Alsana's wall shattered from the force of whatever blast front struck it. The woman threw her hands up to cover her face as Lud ducked their head down to similarly avoid being struck by the chunks of ice now racing past them. Time slowed for Alsana. Through the now exposed view of the dragon, she saw the brown-scaled beast's head recoiling to the side, teeth flying from its maw as a rippling impact washed over the side of its face, cracks ran over the surface of its scales. Directly next to its head, and its blind spot, was a very familiar-looking hammer. The giant lump of titanite steel bounced away from the skull of the dragon, its owner laughing madly as he sprinted towards the danger without a care in the world. With a grunt, Leto kicked off the ground and into the air with his hands outstretched to grasp his weapon once. His palm struck the pole of the hammer with an audible clang of metal before his fingers wrapped around it. Still laughing as loud as he could, Leto started to himself in a corkscrew circle, using the hammer to add speed to his rotation until he became little more than a cackling blur. The Silver Knight paused at the climax of his swing as he closed in on the dragon, turning his body and pivoting himself to be upright and with his hammer held aloft as if he was ready to put in a final nail. The dragon turned their head to the sound of laughter, the single yellow orb widening in alarm as it watched the knight accelerate downwards towards its face with the weapon. The neck of the dragon was already turning to avoid the knight, the snake-like muscle in the motion of twisting to avoid the knight. As if Alsana would allow such a thing. Ice rushed up from the ground at incredible speeds. It didn't need to be strong, but it just needed to stop the dragon's movements for a split second. Long enough for Leto to land his hit upon it. The frozen tendrils warped themselves into the shape of roots and split apart, pulling more and more moisture from the air, and thanks to all the explosions and fires melting the snow, there was plenty of it, to hasten their growth. The tendrils wrapped around the neck of the dragon in an instant. The eye of the beast widened as it felt its movements grow stiff for a split second. The ice itself creaked and groaned barely a second after it snagged itself around the throat of the dragon before it shattered. To the outside eye, it would have seemed as though the ice shattered the second it touched the throat of the lizard. To Leto, he saw it as his opportunity. Ha! With a mighty roar, the Silver Knight brought his hammer down with all his strength. The face of the weapon collided with the forehead of the dragon with an air-splitting crunch. The air around the head of the dragon rushed outwards in a sphere, the blast rushing over Alsana and having her wince at the volume of it. Scales exploded, shattering into minuscule shards as the dragon's head was rather violently shoved backwards with the force of the hit. The dragon stumbled away from the diminutive figure of the knight, Leto already falling back down to earth in a straight line. Having struck the dragon hard enough to almost jerk to a halt in the air and kill off any momentum from his leap in the process. That would never have worked with an everlasting dragon. Leto gleefully exclaimed as he twirled the gammer around in his hands, his body crashing into the snow with his knees bending to absorb the impact. This is much easier. He was already charging forwards, catching a glimpse of Alsana from the corner of his eye, Gordon said to tell Nero that you needed help. The man didn't wait for a response, already rushing towards the dragon as it shook its head from side to side, pulling free chitinous shards which had buried themselves in its own flesh. The mangled remains out its outer skin flaked off its body, its snout curling into a savage snarl as a guttural roar broke free from its throat. Leto kicked off the ground in a short jump, leaping towards the dragon with his hammer pulled back once more. This time the jump was not as high as the last, he wasn't aiming for its head but rather its feet. After all, a dragon with broken toes wouldn't be nearly as effective at moving around. At the very least, that was the thought process of the berserker, not that Alsana was privy to such tactics at the time. The air around the dragon swirled and roared, the vortex surrounded the beast before rapidly expanding outwards in a rush of power. Leto was knocked off course, being blasted back the way he had come from the sudden output of magical energy accompanied by a roar from the dragon. Leto made a small noise of surprise as he crashed back into the ground, rolling for a few meters before twisting around onto his feet. "All right," the knight commented with a shake of his head, "that's a new one." His grip on his hammer tightened, "Not that I mind though." He called out at the top of his lungs, positioning himself with the hammer resting upon the ground. "Try your best, dragon. I'll show you that we silver knights slew your race." As if responding to the knight's challenge, the dragon let out another snarl as it lowered itself as if getting ready to pounce. Its single eye darting between the berserker and caster. Akal staggered as the golem slammed its fist into her guard, the woman then let out a grunt as she parried the blow to the side. Stepping forwards, she swung her opposite arm upwards in a punch, her fist reducing the golem back to its base elements in a shower of dirt. Drawing her hand back, she narrowed her eyes onto Cu Chilane. The blue-haired man already working his magical energy and crafting another symbol along the ground. The magecraft to remold the earth as one deemed fit, the power of primordial runes giving life to the very ground they trod upon. Made all the more easier to access the raw materials necessary as their battle had upturned the frozen mud all around them, barely a speck of snow to be seen amongst the impact craters or blast points. Her eyes flashed to the side, the caster was ignored and both her hands came up for a block. The blade of Brynhilder's spear cracked against her guard a moment later. The pair of them then swung out their legs in response, both looking to catch their opposing fighter with a counter. The end result was a thunderous crack as their knees collided with one another, freezing for a moment before they both stepped backwards. Brynhilder looked less like the maiden she had done when the fighting started, her hair was matted and frayed, parts of her armor blasted off around her legs and sections of her dress burned away around her shoulders. Her pristine skin was now covered in mud and bruises. Akal looked no better, cuts littered her body accompanied by sections along her hands where the skin had been flayed from her knuckles. Not that she seemed to care in the least for the streams of blood running down her arms and fingers. The woman rolled her shoulders slightly. "That was a powerful explosion earlier, how do you think your allies are faring at this moment?" Neither fighter responded, prompting a slightly disappointed frown from Akal. "Is fight banter not something humans of this world practice?" she questioned, stalking around Brynhilder while her eyes remained on a swivel between both the lancer and the caster. Neither one opted to respond to the woman for a moment before Cu exhaled. "I mean, what the heck do you want to even banter about?" That brought a pause to Akal. "I'm not sure," she admitted with a shrug, "it's just that my king was trying new things, so I didn't want to be left behind. Then again, I'm just content with watching him." She cracked a smile. "It's always something special to oversee the growth of someone, isn't it?" Her words struck something within Brynhilder. The woman narrowed her eyes slightly. "You are not invested in the goal of your master." "I'm invested in his growth as an individual," Akal corrected, "and of the story he will weave. I am invested in watching its birth right up to the point of its end." With a sharp twist of her heel, she spun on the servant and launched herself forwards like a rocket, swinging her fist down and into the flat side of the lancer's spear as she brought it up in a block. "That still makes me invested in his goal, just as a member of the audience." Brynhilder twisted around, knocking the fist to the side and sweeping her leg up in a kick. Her shin cracked against the side of the caster before they swung out in a counter, catching her in the chest with a quick jab and knocking her back. Even with the brief stumble, the lancer was quick to compose herself for combat as Akal rushed forwards with a series of body shots. The spear twisted and turned, either catching the knuckles along the surface of the handle or being used to knock the fists to the side and cause them to miss their targets. "Isn't it something wonderful?" Akal spoke casually, even as she continued to throw punch after punch, if he wins, that will birth so many new stories and I'll get to see each and every one of them. I might even get the chance to partake in a few. That just sounds like you're bored. The woman slid to a halt, kicking back to avoid the burst of flames from the caster. The man having darted away from his last position and moving to another one, keeping his focus on the dragon woman even as he ran around the outside of the battle. Can't you do anything better for kicks? I've been alive for longer than the human history of this world. Akal dryly responded as her back crashed into something. The woman blinked and glanced over her shoulder. The fierce scowl of the golem glared back at her before the sculpted arm was raised up and sent crashing down into the side of her head. Despite that, Akal didn't break her concentration. Most of that time I spent guiding whatever human happened to find me along the path to grant them clarity beyond the flow of time. Separating themselves from the woes of life, she thrust her leg out and dropped down, spinning on her heel and sweeping the shins out from underneath the golem. As it fell forwards, she surged upwards and rammed her shoulder into the construct. The being crumbled back into dirt and washed over her body into a mound on the floor. I think that in this new life, I'm entitled to. She was cut off by Brynhildr slicing into her face with the spear. The weapon swung upwards and catching the caster by surprise, she staggered backwards with the force of the blow as Brynhildr halted the upwards movement and then reversed it back down. Akal grunted slightly, more with being forced down as the spear buried itself nearly an inch into her right shoulder. With a sigh, the dragon woman thrust her hand out and clamped it down around the pole of the spear. I think I'm entitled to a chance where I can actually see what it was that the humans were using me to escape from, she remarked, then thrust her leg out in a kick. Brynhildr's right hand released the spear and shot forwards, catching the shin before it could strike her. Wouldn't you be curious about it? I've spent so long seeing the end of all these stories, so I just asked myself, what would it be like to be in one? And now I have my answer. The hand around the spear glowed, the telltale sign of the caster preparing another explosion of flames. Akal's shin froze solid before that could even happen. The woman widened her eyes as she took notice of the faint glowing symbols around the lancer's hand. You. Brynhildr threw her spear upwards. Akal's hand, still attached to it, was swung upwards as well, with the woman giving a brief grunt of surprise. The moment the lancer released her hold on the leg, it dropped like a rock back to the ground and sent the caster off balance somewhat. More than enough for the Valkyrie to take advantage. Stepping into her guard, Brynhildr swung her right-left hand forwards like a spear directly into the throat of the caster. Akal widened her eyes and stumbled back from the involuntary reaction. Despite not feeling pain, that didn't mean that her body suddenly didn't need basic functions. A sweeping kick to her inner knee sent the caster dropping down onto one leg, then falling backwards as the other leg swung upwards and smashed an armored shin directly into her nose. Akal fell backwards, coughing in and out as she made to stand back up. Twisting on her heel, Brynhildr lowered her body and thrust her right leg upwards as she span. The back of her heel cracked against Akal's cheek as she performed a roundhouse kick with enough force to send the caster skating across the ground and freeing her spear from the grasp of the servant. Brynhildr kicked off the ground, leaping up and grabbing a hold of her weapon before twisting it and aiming the tip downwards directly onto the caster as she bounced from her violent punch. A shunt of magical energy was all that was needed to propel the lancer down like a rocket. The tip of her spear burst to life with violet flames as she drove it directly into the chest of the servant and obscured the pair of them in a pillar of fire. A moment later, Akal was sent flying from the attack, once more skipping along the surface of the ground, but this time with a horrible burn along her abdomen for her troubles. Brynhildr swept her spear through the cloud, dissipating it and unveiling herself once more. Her eyes narrowing as she watched Akal stick out her hand and thrust it into the ground to stop her momentum. The caster was jerked to a halt and fell face down into the snow. For a second she remained there, then raised up her free hand and pushed it against the ground, rising up and twisting her head upwards to fix her sights on the lancer. All right then, she grunted out, pushing herself back onto her feet and staggering for a moment as she tried to put weight on her frozen leg. She looked down at it and frowned before raising the flat of her palm towards the limb and unleashing a torrent of concentrated fire upon the limb, melting the ice entirely while giving no indication that she was affected by charring the top layer of skin and incinerating the boots she wore. That was a good, here we go, grand scale. See you cut her off, calling out at the top of his lungs and slamming his palm into the ground. Akal briefly looked at him in surprise, then her eyes snapped upwards as she saw a series of pale blue magical symbols emerge in the air at least 3 meters above them. A split second later the same symbols appeared at her feet, spreading across the land and the sky all around them in a circle. With a laugh, the caster twirled his staff and shouldered it. I don't mind you talking, makes it much easier to pull off something like this. The staff burst into flames. Besides, now I can actually get around to fighting like I want to fight. What do? A call made to speak then blinked and stumbled as she felt a pressure build up around her. She stared down at her arms in surprise as a sense of tension coiled through her body. If she was to describe it in one word, it would have been fatigue. She was being drained, her magical energy weakened even with the support of Calamate as her master and his link with the Holy Grail. A laugh pulled its way from her throat. I suppose I should have listened to Artoria and not spoken too long. She mused to herself with a shake of her head, then looked back to the duo and assumed a combat stance. Quite so. A curt voice called out. A call darted her eyes to the left and watched as a third figure approached them. Sigurd pushed up the rim of his glasses as he gazed at the dragon woman dispassionately, a call thinning her lips as her eyes darted to the bloodied sword in his grasp. I take it that she's dead then. A call muttered out, her voice oddly emotionless as she spoke, inhaling and then exhaling. Well, if you are here then there is no other explanation. I'm feeling a little irritated now. Sigurd didn't respond with words, instead he raised up his sword and pointed it towards the caster. Well, nothing I can do about that now. Raising her hands, she slapped them together once, then whistled out as loudly as she could. Their heads snapped up. Hamra grunted as she stared towards the sky. The faint whistling on the wind alerted them all to the call of Mother. Spreading her wings wide, the Draken launched herself forwards with a beat of her wings, opening up her maw and unleashing a cry. The call was soon responded to by dozens of her siblings, each one of them of differing colors or bulks, all with a variety of replies. The Drakens shot out from the arctree, rising into the air and flying towards the battlefield. The dark clouds of smoke and roaring flames would have been visible for miles around, even in the night that now engulfed them all. The chaos of the battle silhouetted from the infernos. Each of the Drakens looked down, focusing on one particular aspect as they broke away from each other into differing groups. Some moved towards the call of Mother, others had heeded the subconscious request from their parent to help their lesser siblings and kill the humans. Hamra was one such. The red-scaled lizard rushed towards the point where the fighting was thickest, and amidst the chaos of her smaller siblings already in battle with what remained of the human forces tightly woven into a semicircle. A large shadow beast at the forefront, shooting out blades of pale blue light towards any who strayed too close. Hamra's eyes narrowed. She raised the spear, absconded from the dead humans, and pointed it down towards the earth. Her fellow Drakens growled in affirmation to the suggestion as they each dived downwards. They could feel the approaching call of another of their parents. The dark one who looked human and rode atop the horse of shadow. Nero grunted as she parried away the jaws of the attacking wyvern. Her muscles flexed as she danced forwards and swung down, cleaving through the chest of the beast and dropping it to the ground. Stand fast, the Emperor called out, if only to give the impression she was actually doing something to control this mess. The moment the fortress had erupted from the ground, they had been put on the back foot to avoid being caught in it. The moment it exploded, it was all they could do to avoid being crushed by falling lumps of debris. At the very least some of the smaller pieces had dissipated in the air, meaning the citadel had been a projection or illusion of a sort. Brynjar, Nero called out, green eyes darting around to try and catch sight of the man. She'd lost sight of him when the cloud of dust swept over them. While she was certain they'd been able to regroup to an extent, she was certain that there were pockets who had been cut off and left to fend for themselves. Despite shouting as loud as she could, Nero was doubtful even her illustrious voice could pierce the fierce sounds of battle. Which meant the man was either dead or out of her reach. A shame, but not something she could worry about now. Eric, she called out to the red-haired warrior, the man snarling like an animal as he smashed his axe into the shoulder of a wyvern. His free hand thrust forwards into the open wound and gripped it tight. With a savage roar, the man flexed his muscles and pulled in opposing directions, ripping the wyvern apart. Eric, did Leto find Alsana? She asked again, ignoring the bloody display of brutality. Grrrrraaahhhh. That is not a literate answer for me, Nero complained, then turned to the side and held up the flat of her crimson sword. The bolt of flames washed over her sword. She lowered the weapon and watched as the attacker swooped overhead and back into the sky. Archers, Nero called out, pointing at it with her left hand before she returned her focus onto the battle ahead of her. Let them get close, then shoot them down for A dozen arrows were sent skywards behind her, climbing into the sky in the vague direction of the attacking beasts. The Norse by her side armed with their bows stepped backwards as the knocked arrows once more, those armed with spears and shields stepped upwards and assumed a defensive position. Was there some sort of ramification for teaching Vikings testudo formations? The Eastern Roman Empire still existed at this point, and it was hardly as though the tales of her people had not come this far north. So the answer was most likely a no. Zalin bounded over their front lines with a single powerful leap, the tiger roaring as it did so with the howls forging new magical spells around its body. The spear-like shards rocketed into the sky, tracking down more wyverns to take out. As it stood, Nero was confident that they could whittle down the numbers to such an extent that they could resume their advance. A crimson burst of light streaking through the sky and striking Zalin in the side of the head dissuaded her of this notion rather swiftly. The shadow cat let out an ear-piercing scream as it was knocked onto its side, half its face burnt down to the skin with smoldering patches of flesh still hissing away loud enough that the Emperor could still hear them. The sudden attack provided a lull in the combat, all eyes focused on Zalin as another beam of blood-red light rocketed across the battlefield and struck the cat in the gut this time, the beast being further knocked back and down. This time the beam did not diminish after a split second and continued the assault for several more moments. All the while the shadow cat was crying out in agony before it collapsed to the ground with a crunch. Nero whirled in the direction the light had come from. From out of the shadows, as if it was forged by the very darkness itself, the armored figure of the Black Knight stepped forwards. Spear still gleaming in their right hand with a menacing crackle of lightning shooting out from the weapon every so often and striking whatever happened to be close enough at the time. The clanking of armored footsteps echoed out as a herald of things to come. The servant did not falter, nor did they show any sign of hesitance as they marched towards the group. Nor did they have true reason to. Nero gulped lightly to herself. If the rumors were true, then this was King Arthur armed with the holy lance Rongomyniad. Nero might not have understood the information the Grail provided for the most part, many of it were magical terms that she had little understanding of, but she could infer enough to understand the danger the spear represented. Especially considering a mere burst of light had felled their support in a mere 2 hits. Having fought King Arthur during the event in Rome, Nero was under no illusions about the strength of this servant. That had been for the amusement of the masses, and the king had still been handily controlling the duel from start to finish. This was a life-or-death struggle. However, Rome would not be so easily cowed. Narrowing her eyes, Nero straightened her posture and tightened her grip on Astus Estus. The sword flickering with brilliant orange flames. Maintain positions, Nero commanded as she bent her knees, pulling her sword back and grasping it with both hands. At this distance, Arthur would most certainly be able to wipe out a good portion of those behind the saber with a mere swing of her lance. Nero would be able to defend against it, whereas the regular humans would be granted no such reprieve. Keep the dragons from breaking your center line, Nero commanded, not even waiting for response before she rocketed forwards. Her diminutive form sliding along the battlefield with great bounding leaps, her dress billowing in the wind to give the appearance of a rose petal in the wind. In this instance, it was a rose that would brave the storm. Mana swirled around Artoria as they took a step forwards, her lance thrummed with magical energy as they awaited the approach of the blonde woman. She was a saber by all accounts, and her face was something noteworthy. Artoria could barely recall such a time where that same face rested upon her. It was a novelty that was quickly dismissed, however. Sweeping her spear forwards, Artoria swung across at the servant in a wide arc, mana ejected from the spear in bursts of red lightning. The woman let out a sharp gasp as stray bolts caught her body, sending shudders through her from an involuntary reaction. She did not let that stop her, the burning red weapon gliding towards the lancer with a powerful swing of the saber. Artoria stepped backwards, the blow flashing through the air just in front of her. Bringing her left hand up, she clenched her fingers into a tight fist before throwing the arm forwards in a lazy jab. The blonde woman pulled her sword back, bringing up the flat of the blade and blocking the punch with the base of the weapon. The lancer was briefly left stumped when she watched the knees of the servant bend and their entire body lean back as the strike landed. This weak, Artoria could not help but comment aloud. This had to be some manner of feint, surely. Or perhaps a diversionary tactic. She examined the face, her face, with a scrutinous gaze. The strained expression, the tightness of her lips and the tensed muscles in the smaller woman's neck were all genuine. Pitiful, Artoria scoffed aloud, pushing her entire body in the punch and transitioning it into a shove. The blonde saber stumbled back with the attack, Artoria brought her lance up above her head and swung down in a powerful motion to get as much momentum behind the swing as possible. The bright green eyes of her opponent widened in alarm as they sidestepped the attack with a good degree of swiftness. The spear hit the ground with a mighty crunch. Cracks had barely started to form before the spear was pulled from the dirt and already in motion once more. Pedaling backwards, it was all the blonde woman could do to dodge the swings of the lance. Not even making the attempt to block them or, when she did, being pushed back with the force of each strike. Ha! Artoria looked to the side with an almost bored motion, watching the bare-chested man charging her down while swinging the large axe with both hands. The metal of the axe itself looked jagged and rough, akin to a molded lump of steel that someone had taken the courtesy of sharpening. The weapon itself had what looked like red vines growing along its surface. The savage snarl of the servant was noted for a brief second. A berserker then, and seemingly a more traditional one than her master was. Raising her spear up sideways, she blocked the swing of the axe and grunted as she repositioned herself, bending her legs slightly to brace her body from the force of the blow. The servant was certainly benefiting from the aid of the madness enhancement. With a dismissive grunt, Artoria shoved the man backwards and pulled the spear back for a thrust. The man held up the flat of his ace as the spear was thrown forwards, cracking against the surface of the chiseled lump of steel with a grinding noise. She paused, raising the flat of her left arm to her side and grunting as the sword of the blonde woman struck it. Tch. Mana coursed through her body. With a deafening roar akin to a dragon, it flooded her being and rushed into her arm. With a swing of the limb she violently parried the blonde woman to the side with enough force to sweep her feet out from underneath her and flip her into a cartwheel. Twisting the spear to the side, he knocked the berserker away while stepping in closer to the saber, bringing her arm back around herself and turning her body. She jerked her body forwards in a sudden motion and smashed her shoulder into the chest of the blonde saber. Mana swirled around her before it was violently ejected from her body like an explosion, the saber being on the receiving end of it. The burst looked more like a tornado of darkened air, the woman letting out a cry of alarm as she was punted away from the lancer in a single motion and spinning away into the distance. Twisting on her heel, Artoria brought herself to bear on the berserker and rushed towards him, thrusting her spear forwards. "Not my husband, harlot." Pale wisps of rust-colored light rushed towards her from the berserker. The venomous nature of the female voice was noted for barely a moment before Artoria saw the light rush into the grooves between her armor and felt them lay atop her skin like a burning acid. She hissed quietly and stopped her movements for a brief moment. "A curse," she scoffed disdainfully, before raising her head and looking at the berserker. "Your talents in the art are pitiful compared to the which I know." She flexed her dragon core, ripping apart the ground at her feet and banishing the curse from her body before it could take hold of her. The berserker raised his left hand to cover his face as debris was blown into him from the mere activation of the magic core. There was a whistling sound behind her. She spun around and swung upwards. Her lance clanged against a flying black greatsword which sent the weapon spiraling into the air before it halted in its motion and rocketed back down into the waiting grip of its wielder. The servant, adorned in steel armor, blue fabric and a full covering helmet, tensed himself as best he could for combat. All the while, Artoria noticed three individuals behind the man scampering away as fast as they could towards the direction of their allies. The blue saber charged forwards with his sword glowing a brilliant gold for a split second before impact. The two weapons collided against one another. Artoria noted the slight stumble in the man's charge as he had done so, which meant he was most likely injured and arriving from a recent battle. His scuffed armor being more so the proof she needed to come to that assessment. A call split the air. The knight in front of her looked up for a brief moment in surprise. More so the fool for him as she shoved his greatsword to the side and then kicked him in the gut in swift motion, the man being staggered away from her by the motion and into a crouch as he grunted in pain. The berserker to her left looked skywards, then snarled as he brought up his axe moments before one of those new dragons, or drakens, as Calamate called them, was upon the man, tackling him to the ground with its arms around his waist while another dropped down and stamped on his weapon to stop it moving. The pair of them raised a wooden club and axe respectively and then started to rain down clumsy blows upon the berserker. "What in the oof?" The knight gasped in surprise before he was similarly assaulted by a draken with deep red scales wielding a spear in its hand. The beast thrust the lance forwards and buried it into the shoulder of the knight. The man grunted for a moment, then swung his sword upwards, cleaving through the polearm and bringing the sword back down. The draken snaked forwards, grabbing his falling arm with both hands and thrusting its head forwards with its maw opened wide, clamping down its upper and lower jaws against the shoulder of the knight and eliciting a pained grunt from the man. His right hand grabbed the beast and shoved it away from him, staggering backwards as the teeth came away from him with a squelching pop. The saber rolled his left arm as he tried to get movement back into it. The Draken with bloodied lips merely snarled at the man as it spread its claws wide and glared at him. "Rrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr grunt and sending a green one skywards while the brown one jumped back to avoid being caught in the swing of an axe. Ha! A red blur crashed into her side while she was preoccupied with whatever was happening, the form of the smaller saber attempting to shove her over while burying her sword into the side of her armor. Artoria grunted at the movement, driving her facing elbow down into the flat of the blade and knocking it away from her body, leaving behind a slash in the side of her breastplate. Artoria spun on her heel, swinging the lance at the same time and very nearly catching the saber in the head with the spiked section of the spear, had the woman not ducked down to avoid it at the last moment. Artoria glanced upwards, watching as the woman spun through the air before swinging her sword down towards her. She darted backwards, allowing the sword to strike the ground with a thunderous crash. Nero's feet touched the ground for less than a second before she was already moving, upon Artoria within a single breath and already swinging towards her once more. The lancer stepped forwards and met the blow halfway with a swing of her spear, noticing the faint red glow surrounding the red saber. Ho! Artoria gave a single noise of mild intrigue before she dismissed it and parried the blow. Nero followed the movement, spinning on her heel and bringing the sword around in an arc from the opposite side. Sword met spear once more in a thunderous crash of weapons. A cloud of debris kicked up by the force, soon blown aside as the weapons met once more with another burst of force. Nero advanced on the lancer, ducking and weaving after each strike and never allowing herself a moment to think. Her arms would have been a blur to the ordinary man, a flash of burning crimson steel falling against the blackened armor of her opponent again and again, each strike being met by the powerful swings of the lancer, neither woman giving an inch of ground as they continued their battle. A groan left Marie's lips as consciousness returned to her. The woman raised her hand to touch against her head. The moment she touched her forehead, she hissed as a flash of pain stabbed lance through her skull. Her hand came away, feeling slick with something running down her fingers and onto her palm. Her right eye cracked open ever so slightly, for whatever reason she wasn't able to move her left. There was a faint shudder beneath her as the ground shook, accompanied by a muffled roar and a crash of steel. The single eye blinked repeatedly to try and clear the red haze from her vision. Her right arm came back down and rubbed along the front of her eye. The pupil widened as she managed to glimpse the arm come away, now smeared with crimson splashes of blood. Last thing she remembered was a gurgling cough came past her lips, spraying out flakes of blood along with the croaking word of T. Tarkus. "I'm here, Mrs. Marie." She almost felt her jubilation at the fact she could still hear his voice. For a moment she had thought that someone had died for her sake once again. "You got hurt. Sorry about that." The knight gave a weak chuckle. "I tried to cover you as best I could but some of the light still hit you." A pause before the knight spoke again. "Don't worry though, I'm sure that Miss Animosphere will be able to do something about." The knight trailed off for some reason, then coughed once in a noise that sounded as though he was trying to eject his lungs. "Sorry about that, that probably didn't sound very nice." He continued to speak in a light tone. However, Marie couldn't quite get away from that sinking feeling building up. Forcing her body to turn as best she could, she twisted her neck in the direction she could hear the knight's voice coming from. Her sapphire blue eye widened the moment it fell upon the man, leaning back against the corpse of a wyvern. His entire left side was missing, his arm, his collar and most of his neck as well. The gruesome sight would have turned anyone's stomach were it not for the fact that he had such a peaceful expression upon his face despite the obvious agony he should have been in. No, he should have been dead long before then. Those sorts of wounds were fatal for any servant. T. Tarkus, Marie croaked out, raising her right arm and pointing a finger towards him almost dumbly. "Why your body?" The man blinked, then cast a glance over his left side and put on a guilty expression. "You shouldn't be looking at this, Mrs. Marie, can you just look away, please?" The man asked almost innocently. "I don't think someone like you should have to see something like this. It's not very nice and I'd feel bad if you got sick over it." Marie didn't so much as move an inch, her eyes still locked onto the dark-haired man's face. "... Can you not move all that much either, Mrs. Marie? Tarkus asked after a moment, sounding quite worried. I wanted to check on you but I don't know all that much about healing and, he cast a glance around them. Well, all these little dragons showed up so I had to try and fight them off. He made a small noise. It's very hard to do that sort of thing with only one arm, you know. Marie sniffled a noise, then uttered a single word, "Why?" Tarkus blinked at her. Because otherwise they would get you. He stated as though it was a silly thing for her to say. I think the Lancer went somewhere else. I would have tried to look but I didn't want to leave you alone and I can't carry you. He glanced down at his missing leg. The wyvern behind me ate my leg. Marie laughed a bit at the words, then broke down into another sniffle. Why did you protect me? That's what a knight is supposed to do. Tarkus once again put on the odd tone of voice. It makes sense, doesn't it? A knight protects a queen. That's what mother always said. He closed his eyes and leaned back, his head thudding against the corpse of the wyvern. I'm quite sleepy right now. Don't go to sleep. Marie hastily pleaded, hissing as she twisted her body over and gasped to herself as another flash of pain assaulted her whole body. In spite of it, she still forced herself onto her hands, dragging her body towards the knight as if she was a child. Don't you dare go to sleep. I can't help that, Mrs. Marie. Tarkus spoke in an almost guilty tone as he visibly struggled to keep his eyes open. But I can stay awake a little longer, if you want. You should probably think about finding the others though. He let out a shuddering breath, a bubble of blood popped in the back of his throat and sprayed the dark liquid over his lips. That's a shame though, I really thought that fortress would work. His lip quivered. I guess it wasn't impossible. Never mind the fortress, Marie stated as she crawled closer to the knight, pushing herself up on her knees and moving around to his injured side. She fought back the taste of bile in her throat from the exposed injuries. She had no idea what she was supposed to do here at all. I don't know why Miss Da Vinci made such a big deal out of it. Tarkus muttered, his voice growing quieter as his eyelids started to drop. No, 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 Marie all but begged, reaching out and cupping his cheeks while turning his face towards her. Look into my eyes, all right. Just look into my eyes while the woman trailed off, darting her head around to see if there was anyone nearby she could call out to. Even if there was nothing to be done. She looked back down and croaked as she saw Tarkus' eyes closed. Tarkus, sorry. The knight hastily apologized. I still can't look pretty women in the face, he remarked. Stop doing that, she exclaimed, pinching his cheeks slightly. Just open your eyes and look at me, all right? You can do that. She jostled his head slightly. Please, please. The eyelids gradually rose upwards, the hazel-colored orbs stared up at the rider with a hint of sadness. Sorry, Mrs. Marie, I don't want to make you sad or anything, he slurred out slightly, the orbs already starting to dull. Marie sniffled, reaching up and wiping her cheek with her left hand. Just don't do that just yet. You can still look away from me when you're all healed up. Tarkus' lip rose into a knowing smile. I'm not that dumb, Mrs. Marie. He responded, I didn't think I was going to survive the attack. But I remembered Miss Da Vinci's words about the impossible and I just figured, at least saving you would be something I could do, right? His smile dropped. I'm sorry I didn't do a better job of it. I'm fine. Marie flashed him a smile, ignoring how much it actually hurt. See, I'm fine. Just make sure you get yourself healed up, right? You said you can do the impossible so just make sure that you live. Tarkus released a shuddering breath as his eyelids dropped. I don't think I can do that sort of impossible thing, he muttered out under his breath, his head starting to drop forwards. Wait. Just hang on for someone to. Mrs. Marie, Tarkus whispered out, can I ask something? You can ask me later when we're all in Chaldea. She hastily cut him off, forcing his head up with her hands. You'll love it there, by the way. So many different sorts of people, I can introduce you to everyone. I'm sure you and Deanne will get along great. She paused, looking for more things to say. We even started making a little building. I'm sure you'd be a great help with that, so just ask me later. I don't think I can. Tarkus replied in a weak voice, golden flakes of light already peeling away from his body. Because I can only do it now. Marie was glaring at the golden motes as they started to pull away, then looked back to the knight. What is it? I'm afraid to die alone. He whispered back, Mother used to hold me when I went to sleep. He sniffled, would it be embarrassing, if I asked for you to. Marie forced his head into the crook of her shoulder before he even finished, wrapping her arms around the back of his head in a tight embrace. And no, she sniffled, not at all. Okay. Tarkus' quiet voice reached her ears, not even sounding flustered at this point. That stung her worse. I'm a little sleepy now. His voice was more muffled at this point, weak and slurred. Is it all right if I go to sleep? Marie whimpered and nodded her head up and down. Mrs. Marie, Tarkus spoke in a gentle tone, I need to know, it's all right, I don't want you to be sad. It's fine. Why, you can go to sleep, if you want. I'll be right here when you wake up. Okay. Tarkus' voice turned warm for a moment. I look forward to waking. His voice fell silent. Marie tightened her hold on the cold body, not even caring for the jagged pieces of armor poking through her dress and into her skin. She simply sat there, rocking the body of the saber back and forth while sniffling to herself. She held him until her hands slipped through empty space and around her body. Then she fell silent. Yes, I am a monster. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 142, The Clash of Wills. Torin's head smacked against the ground, the fist of Calamate fell a moment later into his chest and pushed the druid further into the crater. The hand came up for a moment before the fist spread wide and shot back down. The sharpened claw-like fingers of the dragon punctured the breastplate of the caster and clenched inwards, folding steel with their powerful grip and hefting the druid upwards. Calamate grunted, turning himself sideways and tossing the servant away from himself. Already moving to catch up with the falling servant, Torin hit the ground with a pained grunt, barely there for a second before Calamate's foot buried itself into his gut and sent the man back into the air accompanied by a booming thud. The caster soared through the sky without making a noise before striking the ground hard, bouncing and leaving behind a scuff mark in the earth before going airborne once again and then landing face first into the ground. Bringing the sword in his right hand up, the dragon advanced on the downed man with the clear intention of ending things here and now. In truth, he had wanted to do so for some time, but something had always been stopping him. Perhaps it had been the belief that the man would be more open to hearing his own reasoning after fighting him for a few moments. Calamate himself had found that speaking after a rather brutal discussion was something that would lead to greater clarity. However, it would appear that such options were not something everyone would benefit from. A shame. He did not want the man to die thinking that Calamate was still the same destroyer he had been in the past, but it was unavoidable at this point. Once he was done here, he could resume his search for. Stop right there, Calamate. Calamate paused in his actions, commanded by the familiar voice that he had been waiting to hear since the battle commenced. The dragon turned to face them, soon spotting the white-haired woman standing in front of the full-body armored individual nearly as tall as himself. Her expression set into a thin line as her eyes looked between the dragon and Torin on the ground briefly. Olga Marie Animosphere, Calamate breathed out, his voice now sounding enthused by her presence. That rain of light upon us. That was you. Yes. It was beautiful. Calamate praised openly. I had not thought someone capable of commanding the sky to strike us down, but I am not surprised you are able to do such a thing. He continued onwards, yet the light could not harm me. Olga's expression didn't change, I know that much. Is it just yourself and the servant behind you? Calamate asked, nodding his head to the silent figure behind the smaller woman. That time, Olga's lip did twitch slightly. Yes. She got out, though sounded somewhat aggrieved by the situation, not that Calamate could understand why that was. Nor why she sent an annoyed glare at the downed caster at Calamate's side for a few seconds longer than he would have thought normal. Not that it changed much in the end. Good. Calamate exhaled. I was hoping it would be just you and me. He explained as he took a single step forwards. The servant behind Olga reacted instantly, hunching its body forwards and brandishing the oversized axe in one hand while raising up the circular shield in the other. His eyes meaningfully fell upon the enlarged servant. Though, I suppose it would not be a fair contest if it was. Olga almost wanted to laugh at him, a dragon who could contend with divine spirits who was also in possession of a mystic eye. It still wasn't a fair contest even with her servant's dragon-slaying abilities. Especially considering that its own skill was based on hers with a weapon. That was to say, novice, in the words of Sigurd. Then again, If the ancient Norse king called her a voice with the blade, then that had to count for something. It at least meant that she was being recognized at the very least. Calamate was silent for a moment before he grunted once. "We should get to fighting now," he declared with an almost even tone of voice. It was almost amusing how casual he was trying to sound. Save for the slight wobble in his tone that made it obvious he was hiding away his excitement at the prospect of fighting. Olga sighed to herself before shaking her head, then putting on a determined stare aimed at the dragon, her hands going into her pockets and coming out as fists with something grasped in her palms, not that Calamate was taking notice of it. The dragon paced away from Torin's prone form, all but ignoring the downed servant as his glowing eyes focused first on Olga, then to the servant standing behind her. Stahl continued to pivot their body as they tracked the dragon's movements, their joints creaking with subtle movements. Calamate eventually stopped walking. Taking a single step forwards, he leaned down low and then kicked off the ground, heading straight towards Olga and Stahl. The Dragon Slayer armor stepped past the director and raised their shield to block the obvious swing. The black hooked sword clanged against the surface of the metal disc with an earth-shattering crunch. The very ground beneath their feet cracked with the impact. Olga herself took a single step backwards as her hair jerkily flapped from the blast. The woman narrowed her eyes and issued mental commands to the servant. Stahl shoved forwards, pushing the shield back with all their might and taking a powerful step to gain more ground. Calamate raised his other hand and pressed it into the top of the sword, pushing back against the slightly smaller servant and holding his ground against the berserker. The two glared at one another for a few seconds before Calamate twisted his body and rammed his shoulder into Stahl's guard to force them backwards. His left hand came away from the top of the sword and clamped down around the rim of the shield, pulling with all his might and spinning as he yanked. Stahl found themselves turning with the berserker and virtually being dragged along for the ride before they swung their axe down into the ground to anchor themselves. Calamate's arm was jerked to a halt, the dragon falling backwards as the limb went taut. With a hefty pull towards himself, Stahl dragged the shield back towards his body while bringing along a stumbling Calamate. Ducking themselves down, they thrust the shield towards the legs of the dragon servant and caused him to trip over it. With a metallic growl, Stahl flipped the dragon over the top of his head. Grunting, Calamate struck the ground in a roll before twisting his body and snapping his head up. Watching as Stahl was already charging towards him with the axe pulled back for a downward strike. The dragon did the only thing he could think of. He swung towards the servant's weapon with his own. The two blades collided with one another with a heavy crash of metal. The two fighters recoiled back as the force pushed against one another reverberated through their arms. Both stared at the opposite before they swung again. Very little in the way of skill and more a case of brute force being used against one another. The result being very much the same as the first clash. Once more the weapons struck the other and the fighters were forced back with a clang of steel. It mattered little from what position they would strike, the end result was always the same. The axe would meet the sword and then the weapons would rebound off one another with a thunderous crash of metal. Upon the 10th strike, the axe of Stahl shattered the sword in Calamate's hands and rushed towards the dragon. Calamate wasted nary a moment in sidestepping the axe and shoving it with his shoulder to redirect it away from him. Swinging his left arm up, he caught the berserker in the chin with the crook of his elbow and threw them into the ground. Stahl rolled for several meters before their heads snapped back up, Calamate already in front of them and in the middle of a swing towards the servant. His fist cracked against a pale yellow barrier before bouncing backwards. The dragon widened his eyes in surprise from the sudden appearance of the shield. Wah! The berserker gave no indication that they could perform anything such as this, and yet it had somehow been able to. His eyes darted downwards, staring at 3 stones on the ground that acted as the anchor for the shield. Then his vision swiftly turned on to the left. He watched Olga lowering her arm slowly, or at normal speed for her, but his senses merely made it appear as though it was slow motions, back to her side, her fingers outstretched from having thrown something. The dragon did the mental calculations in his head and easily deduced it was something that Olga herself had done. That was foolish of him. After all his preaching about seeing her as an equal, he still thought of the larger servant as the greater threat. This wasn't a case of a one-on-one, it was a 2-on-1 battle. Stahl charged forwards, shattering the pale yellow barrier outwards and slamming the shield into Calamate's gut. The berserker staggered back with the blow, only for the servant to continue the offensive and swing the shield up and crack Calamate in the lower jaw with the rim of the shield. Stepping forwards, Stahl stamped down on Calamate's foot and held him in place. The dragon let out a pained gasp and his toes were crunched under boot. Hunching his body forwards, the pained gasp barely escaped Calamate before Stahl swung their head forwards and crashed it into the center of Calamate's own forehead. The foot still entrenched upon his toes kept the dragon from stumbling away from the berserker in pain. Raising the shield up, Stahl prepared to thrust it forwards like a spear, only for Calamate's left arm to shoot out and grasp the edge of the shield in a tight grip. The dragon snarled for a moment, then his palm exploded in brilliant yellow flames. The shockwave of the explosion knocked Stahl away from the dragon and into a roll backwards. Olga herself threw up her hands in front of her face as the blast front hit her and very nearly swept her off her feet. The biting chill of icy shards striking against her had the woman bite back a hiss of pain. Her arms were lowered swiftly, locking onto the cloud of dust and ice that had been kicked up by the powerful explosion. The director narrowed her eyes slightly as they darted around them. With a mental command she called Stahl back to her side while also sneaking a glance towards Torin, scowling at the pitiful state he was in. Honestly, it was his own fault for doing something as stupid as that. What did he honestly expect was going to happen? A dragon who could apparently fight the Sigurd on equal footing was not going to be done in by someone who was barely able to fight a regular dragon. This is why she made a plan. If he had followed the plan, then he wouldn't be lying face down in the snow like a fool, and she wouldn't be having to think of burning up a command spell just to get him back on his feet. The smoke parted, Calamate came charging out of the cloud directly towards her. The woman widened her eyes and made to cry out in alarm, watching as the speeding berserker closed the distance between the two of them in barely a second. Olga's feet hadn't even left the ground in her effort to throw herself back before the fist of the dragon was already a foot from striking her head. Calamate's face contorted in pain as the axe head of Stahl buried itself into his side, the berserker twisting with the impact and growling before a crackling of yellow lighting shot out from the weapon and rushed over his body before exploding outwards. Olga was knocked to the ground while Calamate was blown away from the impact, twisting his body in the air and landing on the ground feet first, skating along the surface with a growl. Pulling his right hand back, mustard yellow flames danced around his knuckles for a second before he thrust the arm forwards. A jet of fire leapt out from his hand and rushed towards the berserker and Olga. Stahl wasted not even a single second in ducking down in front of the director and raising their shield upwards to cover the woman's body. Not making a single sound as the flames washed over them, the shield held firm in protecting the woman behind them from harm. "Any servant nearby, I'm engaging Calamate," Olga called out through the mental link. "Help me." Despite the call for help, there were very few servants who actually heard her and none whom could have directly answered the call in the first place. All of them engaged in combat of their own with an opponent. Brambled vines snaked from the ground, wrapping around the burned leg of Akal as she tried to dance backwards. The plants holding her just long enough for Sigurd's fist to slam into her cheek with a haymaker. Her jaw clicked with the strike and flew open, teeth jettisoned out from her lower jaw and flew across the snow, accompanied by a splatter of blood. The saber stepped in close, swinging his left hand upwards with a dagger in his grip aimed towards her gut. Akal thrust out her palm, catching the dagger with it even as it burst through the back of her hand and carried the limb upwards towards her chest. Akal's fingers wrapped around Sigurd's fist and held him there for a brief second. Then Brynhildr kicked her in the side of the head with a flying leap, her body shunted by the attack and her hand loosening its grip on the saber. Sigurd thrust upwards once more and buried the edge of the dagger jutting from the back of her palm directly into her ribs. Despite not feeling any real pain, Akal could tell that was still not a good thing. Her right hand came up and swung at Sigurd, the ghostly visage of the giant fist emerged from the air around her and raced towards the saber as a fist. Before it could even touch him, an equally massive hand made of thatched straw burst from a circle carved into the ground and caught the fist in its palm. Akal's movements halted as the phantom pressure from the giant hand exuded itself on her arm. The woman grit her teeth before Sigurd delivered a savage kick into her side and knocked her backwards. The saber wrenched the dagger from her body and then reversed his grip with it. His right hand went for a second dagger upon his belt, which he promptly detached and held in a similarly reversed grip. Akal kicked backwards to get some distance on the saber, then widened her eyes as she saw Brynhildr flying towards her with her spear extending in a thrust. A stone wing burst from her bag, cracking as it formed in the air and then curled around her body like a shield. The tip of Brynhildr's spear struck the wing and halted all form of momentum, the weapon utterly failing to penetrate the limb, earning a faint blink of surprise from the lancer before she frowned and swung her body forwards, using the spear as in support. Placing her heels against the wing, she kicked off it and forced the caster to be shunted away from her while also throwing herself clear. As she flew through the air, she caught a brief glimpse of Siyu Chilane as he twisted his hands in front of himself and forged lighting runes that hovered in front of him. A split second later, he hurled the runes forwards in a single burst of lightning which struck the outer surface of the pseudo-shield. A split second later, Akal let out a cry of pain as the ghostly limb shattered into fragments of dust and was blown away from her body, exposing her once more to the outside world just in time for Sigurd to charge straight into her with a shoulder barge. The spikes on his armor goring into her side and keeping her embedded on him for a few moments, he wrapped his left arm around the back of her legs and threw his body downwards, making sure that Akal took the brunt of the impact. The pair crunched against the snow with a meaty thud, Sigurd rolling over the top of the woman and snapping off the spikes in his shoulder plates inside her chest. The woman hissed to herself as blood now flowed from more wounds littering her body. Sigurd landed in a crouch and swiftly turned around, raising the twin daggers above his head before slamming them down into Akal's opposing shoulders. The saber sharply rose up, dragging the caster with him, then started to spin himself around like a windmill, pulling the caster along with him as he pair of them rotated at incredible speeds. After a couple of seconds the saber stomped his foot down to halt his momentum, his boot cracking the ground under his heel, and then swung the caster away from his body. The daggers pulled free of her flesh with a squelch and sent her cartwheeling through the sky. Brynhildr shot forwards, staying close to the ground and passing directly beneath the caster as she hurtled through the air before shooting past her. Sticking her foot out, Brynhildr slid to a halt and turned about face, bringing her spear back and gripping it with both arms as she narrowed her eyes at the caster closing in on her, having positioned herself directly in the flight path of the servant. With a sharp intake of breath, Brynhildr swung her spear forwards like a bat. The bladed head slammed directly into the gut of the caster as she approached and bent the servant over the blade for a split second, then the strength of the swing caught up with the servant and she was sent rocketing back into the air with a boom. The power of the strike displaced the air around them for a split second before she shot up like an arrow. Sigurd threw Gram into the air, the blade spinning around as it fell back to earth. His eyes narrowed upon the gradually shrinking dot of the caster as they flew further and further away. Shifting his position, Sigurd turned side on and angled his body upwards slightly while tracking her movements. His left hand briefly moved to push the rim of his glasses up while his right hand clenched into a fist and his arm coiled back in preparation for a punch. Extending his left arm out, he clenched that hand into a fist and mentally counted out the distance in his head as well as where the servant was going to be. As Gram fell back to earth, still spinning, the saber breathed in once, then held the air in his mouth. The sword fell in line with his arm. He exhaled, then swung his arm forwards with as much power as he could muster. His knuckles struck the pommel of his sword and his entire body seemed to freeze for a split second. Then the sword shot away from him with a sonic boom. There was a brief moment where the sword seemingly struck an invisible barrier before it tore past it, accelerating into the sky as a glowing arrow of light. Then the shockwave from the punch raced away from the saber and washed over the two other servants present. Sigurd watched the brightness of his sword climb into the sky, his eyes narrowing as he watched it make contact with the servant and then carrying them away with the newfound momentum. Raising his right arm, he opened up his hand and sent out a twitch with his magical energy towards his blade. The glowing light halted in the air for a few seconds before it raced back down to earth, aiming directly for the wielder of the sword. The saber's face remained impassive, even as the weapon accelerated towards him at incredible speeds that even a servant would have found difficult to react to. Sigurd, through all of that, had little reason to be worried. After all, it was his own sword that he was returning back to him. Added weight onto its blade aside, his superior vision caught sight of the servant skewered on the end of the blade, the front of his sword jutting from their gut and their hands grasping at the weapon in an effort to pull themselves free of it. The woman turned her head over her shoulder, her eyes widened ever so slightly as she saw the rapidly approaching ground and the saber staring up at her. With a final burst, the sword accelerated once more into the grasp of its master. The moment the grip was in his hand, Sigurd spun the weapon around like the hands on a clock in front of his body before slamming the weapon, and a call, into the ground in an explosion. Debris soared upwards in a mushroom cloud, the blast front washing over the servants and shattering the magical circles that Cu had crafted around them to weaken Akal's magical energy. Not that it was probably going to help her at this point, there were very few servants who would be able to take punishment like that. Especially dragon servants being stabbed with Gram of all things and then bodied by Sigurd. Sigurd yanked the sword back, the swiftness of the movement and the power behind the slash parted the clouds in a moment. sweeping them aside and exposing the mess beneath his feet. Akal lay on her back, facing skywards with her chest a ruined mess. Her abdomen was carved inwards and blood splattered behind her body, coloring the snow a bright crimson as more and more flowed from the woman onto the ground. The woman opened her mouth in an attempt to speak, only to give a wet cough and cause more blood to be ejected from her mouth like a geyser. The woman lay there, her eyes flickering towards the saber for a brief moment before they dulled. Swallowing back the blood, she closed her eyes. This is a first, she spoke quietly, her voice unchanged from her crippling injuries. I want to stick around until the end of the story. Sigurd twisted the sword in his hands, reversing his grip on the weapon and holding it pointed towards Akal's head. His left hand placed upon the pommel of the weapon. That is the manner of all humans. They wish to live until they see their dreams completed. Akal hummed in response, more blood leaking from her mouth and down her cheeks. Then again, I suppose not everyone gets a choice when they are removed from the tail, do they? Some do, Sigurd offered with a shrug, lowering the sword until the tip of the weapon touched the caster's skin. Most do not. A shame, Akal sighed. Did you? Sigurd was silent for a moment before he thinned his lips. In life, I did not. He admitted to himself, though as a servant. His eyes flashed towards Brynhildr and his features softened. He saw the way in which Cu rolled his eyes and made a face at the duo. I believe I have come as close to obtaining my desire as I shall ever get. Brynhildr flushed before coughing into her hand. Akal raised an eyebrow at him, then looked to Brynhildr before making an expression of understanding. That's nice. I suppose I'm the same, she muttered, then leaned her head back into the snow. I think Calamate will be satisfied either way, though perhaps I got a little more invested in it than him. A wry smile worked its way onto her lips. I wanted to see my children all grown up. As do all mothers. That is natural. Akal hummed once, before I die. How do you see me? She tilted her head, looking up at the saber and opening her eyes once more. I'm curious. I know how Calamate saw me, but how did the humans see us? She paused for a moment. I believe the phrase is, one kingdom's hero is another kingdom's villain. It was not a case of villainy. Sigurd shook his head, merely a conflict of interests. While there are those who will decry you and your kindred as savage monsters, the world is better without. Quite the flatterer. Akal jested with a twitch of her lip. Sigurd snorted at that. I have been told as much by my wife. He admitted with a nod of the head, but as for myself, I cannot say I hate you. I can oppose you for what your people did to mine, but I cannot hate you for the act of invading another's land and taking it over. He chuckled. If I hated you for that, I would have to hate my own people as well. Akal hummed once. All right then. She exhaled. I'm ready. With a single nod of his head, Sigurd thrust the sword down. Cu exhaled, watching as the motes of light drifted away from the servant. Tough lass, He shook his head before he steeled his expression. All right, Master just sent out a call for help, so I'd say. He turned as he spoke, then cut himself off as he watched a wyvern land on the ground in front of him. Although there was one noticeable difference about this wyvern, that being the presence of upper arms, which were also gripping a large axe in their clawed fingers. The dark-scaled beast glared hatefully at them as their eyes looked to where Akal was already fading away. Mo, there, the beast croaked out in a guttural hissing language. The eyes of it then darted towards the group once more. Mo, there, What in the shit? Cu blinked, taking a single step back. Oi. Another of the lizards dropped down in front of them, this one wielding a longsword in its right hand. Then another, and another, and another. By the end of it, 8 of the armed wyverns, in both senses of the word, stood before the group all hissing and growling with clear anger and rage. Sigurd grimaced as he brandished Graham once more. To think they were already capable of speech. He muttered out as his eyes narrowed, she did not exaggerate the will of her leader. He truly did seek to replace humanity in this era. He exhaled, we must not let a single one escape. No kidding, Cu grunted, twirling his staff and cracking his neck. No sense in leaving a job half-finished, Brynhildr didn't make a comment, her spear glistening with light as she lowered it towards the group. Leto darted from side to side as he charged towards the dragon, no longer laughing as he remained solely focused on the beast in front of him. So complete was his focus that he did not even so much as notice the wyverns armed with weapons rushing towards him and swinging. He ran them over, barreling into them at full speed and sending them flying over his body as he did so. The knight paid no heed to anything except his target. As was directed by his madness enhancement, until it was destroyed or gone from his sight he would let nothing stand in his way or distract him. The dragon surged forwards, its powerful jaws opening wide in a move to try and snap up the knight in a single bite. It would have likely succeeded had Leto not twisted his hammer sideways at the last moment to keep the dragon's jaws from closing around him. The knight dangled from the pole of his weapon as the dragon raised its head into the air, still at an angle. With an angered snarl, it soon started to shake the knight from side to side in an effort to remove him from the hammer. Leto, however, maintained his grip on the weapon with a vice-like grip, not loosening his hold for even a moment lest he be flung into the distance. All while the dragon was busy swinging the knight around like a doll, Alcana was busy contending herself with battling the drakens who had arrived shortly after. Their numbers were reasonably small when compared with the wyverns, around 5, but they made up for it with superior speed and similarly improved endurance. Even those that Leto had run down had gotten back up a moment later with nary a scratch on their body. The snarling lizards charged towards the shadow cat as it glared back at them. Its fanged maw opened up before it let loose a burst of magical energy from its throat. The crystalline shards rushed towards the attackers and swept over them. 3 of the 5 leapt skywards into the air in order to avoid being caught by the attack. The other 2 were caught up in the breath. The closest draken was shredded by the directed blasts of magical energy against its scales. The second one threw up its arms in a blocking motion and managed to avoid dying in favor of simply having its right arm mangled. With a mental command accompanied by a wave of her hand, she grew large spikes from the icy tundra towards the injured draken. As the breath faded away, the frozen spears shot upwards like arrows directly into the chest of the wounded beast and lifted its corpse into the air like an ornament. The woman's eyes flickered to the side, then narrowed upon the draken rushing down towards her with a spear in its hands. Her eyes flashed. Though it shamed her to use it, she could still call upon her true nature as a fragment of fear. She had tapped into that ability unconsciously in the past whenever she would speak, however focusing it on someone was an entirely different matter. In that split second, the draken's mind was flooded with horrific thoughts about what would occur if it got closer. The beast's wings locked up and its eyes bulged as its heart, quite literally, stopped beating. Alcana watched the beast drop down to the earth like a rock, crashing into the snow and sliding along the ground for a few meters before halting, not having realized she had truly scared the beast to death. Though with their experiences so little, the draken had never truly experienced the emotion known as fear and thus had no true way to counter it. Her eyes turned upon the remaining drakens as Lud growled beneath her, the shadow cat stalking forwards with its crimson-red eyes darting from draken to draken. Lowering their body down slightly, the tiger let out a crackled growl before it pounced skywards at the remaining pair. As Lud rushed past the pair of them, Leto was still being violently swung around in the maw of the dragon, desperately trying to shape him free. After a few moments longer and clearly at its wit's end, the beast snarled and allowed the back of its throat to glow. Leto merely smirked. Waiting for that, he called out, this time swinging around on the pole as though it was a monkey bar and releasing his grip at the height of his swipe. Or rather, he released his grip with one hand and twisted the hammer with the other. The knight pried the weapon from the jaw of the dragon as it snapped shut in surprise, smoke billowing out from the gaps between its upper and lower jaw. The golden eye of the dragon narrowed onto the knight as it watched him jump towards its face. Leto grinned behind his helmet as he swung his arm around and snagged his hand along the scaled ridge above the eye of the dragon. Then pulled himself up with his left hand while swinging up his right knee, slamming his armored leg directly into the remaining eye of the dragon and causing it to recoil back and snarl, violently shaking its head from side to side in an effort to try itself free of the knight. Kicking off the head, Leto launched himself directly above the dragon and into the sky, extending his hammer out with his hand and lowering his left hand onto it. Dropping back down, the knight bent his knees as he slammed into the top of the dragon's skull with enough power to force its head down. Never tried this with dragon scales before, Leto stated as he pressed the flat of the hammer onto the section where he had originally struck the dragon. But, oh well, with a sharp intake of breath, he channeled magical energy into the hammer and activated its effect. The cracked sections of scale were suddenly and rather violently pulled towards the metal. The dragon roared as its scales around its forehead peeled away to reveal the soft flesh underneath. Bit by bit, the size of the hammer grew and the brown scales clung to the surface of the weapon as though they were welded onto it. A bit ironic, but this is my call to stone. Leto exhaled, pulling the hammer up with an audible grunt and raising it above his head. I'll take a page from my friend's book and kill a dragon with a part of its own body. With a cry of exertion, he swung the hammer down with as much power as he could muster directly into the top of its skull. The bone resisted for a fleeting moment and then gave way. The skull caved inwards with the pressure the knight placed upon it. The crunch of bone and the cracking of scales filled the air before the cries of the dragon fell silent. The beast's single eye rolled upwards as dark blood dripped down from the ocular organ and down its cheek. Whoa! Leto called out in surprise, stumbling slightly as the dragon started to teeter over. The knight kicking off the caved skull was the final nail in the coffin to send the body of the dragon crashing down to earth onto its side. Leto struck the ground with a crunch, rolling along for several meters before slowing himself to a halt. That was something else, he exclaimed out in his merry tone of voice. Then looked around in surprise when he noticed the shards of ice, the dead drakens and the shadow cat with the final of the beasts impaled on its teeth. Alsana looked down on the silver knight somewhat imperiously. What happened here? Leto asked in complete confusion, reaching up and scratching the side of his helmet somewhat awkwardly. Nero jumped backwards, the woman's face awash with effort as she continued to backpedal away from the lancer. Artoria matched her every step of the way without allowing the saber a moment to even recover. The initial advantage had since been lost and now the lancer was thoroughly controlling the duel. Each swing of the lance had enough force to stagger the Emperor of Roses, something she knew as she focused more on redirecting the attacks rather than taking them head-on. She had little doubt that the lancer was using the dragon core that her other version had. In truth, Nero considered this far more terrifying than the duel in Rome, if only because one wrong step would likely cost her entire head. The lancer stepped forwards, thrusting the spear with a single joust and striking the flat of Nero's sword. The weapon caught the attack for a brief second before the lance erupted with magical energy. Nero found her sword blasted from her palms and sent sailing through the air. The Emperor widened her eyes in alarm as her eyes fell upon the spear already being pulled back for another thrust towards her. The darkened axe of Eric slammed into the side of Artoria's head, glancing over her helmet and causing her thrust to miss Nero completely. The berserker snarled as he bodily shoved the lancer to the side, causing her to stumble over her feet in an effort to correct herself. Nero took the opportunity to scamper away, already rushing in the direction that her sword had flown off towards. Artoria turned her body on the berserker as he lashed out with his axe once more in wild swings. The lancer frowned behind her helm as the next blow felt a touch more powerful than the last. As the weapons clashed once more, her eyes tracked the axe head as it was pulled back in preparation for another swing. The red veins which spread across the weapon seemed to pulsate rapidly, almost as if the axe itself was alive, drawing in the blood that stained the weapon to fuel it further. It would appear that the more the servant killed, the more powerful they would become, or perhaps the stronger their weapon was. A mild distinction, but one barely worth noting. Drawing the lance across her body, Artoria swung the weapon out in a wide arc directly into the guard of the berserker. The man raised up his axe and braced his body to catch her attack. At the last moment before impact, she activated her draconic core. The lance positively exploded with crimson light before it smashed into the berserker like a jet engine, blasting through his guard and sending the weapon flying from his grasp. Artoria stomped forwards, lowering her body and swinging her left hand at full force directly into the kidney of her opponent. Eric's face contorted with the strike. The man coughed out in pain and stumbled back as the lancer withdrew her fist back, the bruise already forming on his bare skin. Bringing her left hand up, she then swung it out in a backhanded motion and cracked it against the cheek of the berserker, spinning him around and into a stumble. The berserker snarled and swung back around, bringing his arm across in a backhanded motion of his own, aiming for the head of the lancer. Artoria switched hands, freeing her right arm from its grip of the spear and raising it up in a blocking motion. Eric's arm collided with Artoria's bracer with a clang. The woman remained unmoved from the attack as she stared back at the berserker. With a grunt, she forcefully parried the attack to the side, stepping in close and then swinging her right arm in an uppercut. Her armored knuckles rammed into Eric's chin, snapping his head back and sending a jet of mana skywards as a result. As the berserker stumbled back, Artoria readied her spear and thrust forwards, puncturing straight through the front of his knee and out the back. The berserker let out a cry of pain as he grasped at the weapon. Artoria gave a dismissive grunt as she ripped the weapon out, tearing the leg apart and dropping the berserker down to the floor. Landing roughly on his side, Eric groaned as he pressed his hands over the mangled remains of his left leg, trying in some way to keep the limb in one piece rather than the two it was threatening to become. The lancer pulled back the spear without an ounce of hesitation and thrust it towards the berserker's head to finish him off. A sword crashed into her spear, slowing it to a halt. The lancer stared down at the long dark greatsword and then towards the servant in question. The blue saber stared back at her, clearly struggling against her effort to finish off his ally. "No further, Dark Knight," the man called out, flexing his muscles and swinging the sword upwards to get her to take several steps backwards. The knight moved to position himself in between the two of them. "You shall have to contend with me first. Given the ease at which I dealt with your allies, you should think more readily of whether those words hold any true weight." Artoria curtly remarked in a dismissive tone of voice, "However, I sense a touch of divinity upon you. That sword you wield is also not one forged by human hands." She raised up the spear. "This lance is the same." The knight shifted his stance. Artoria watched as he seemingly favored his left side as a right-handed swordsman would. It made him either ambidextrous, like many skilled swordsmen were, or he was left-handed. Something she would deduce handily after a few strikes. The two servants stared at one another for a few moments, then rushed forwards. The knight swung up from the left side directly towards the guard of the lancer. Something that earned a raised eyebrow from her as she moved to catch him. Then he kicked off the ground and flipped forwards, twisting his body through the air as if in a roll and bringing the greatsword above his head as he did so. Swinging down, Artoria turned the lance at the last moment to catch the falling slash from the knight as he reached her. His body bouncing back as the sword recoiled away from her swing, his armored boots hit the sword with a crunch before he was darting forwards once more, slashing down into the snow and kicking up a small blizzard directly into her face. She banished it away with a simple flex of her mana, exposing the knight as well as the thrust he was in the middle of working himself into. He thrust forwards at the same time she did. Both weapons grazed against one another and were directed away from the intended target. Gordon's sword went high, glancing just over the top of Artoria's right shoulder. Artoria's spear was directed downwards, Gordon swerving his body to the side and avoiding being run through by the spear. He turned his body fully, kicking away from the lancer and shoving her from him to get some more distance. Artoria's mana flexed around her, unleashing a burst from her body in the form of a twirling dark cloud which sent Gordon rocketing away from her and into a roll. The knight turned his body, twisting himself around and slinging his left arm forwards. The greatsword flew from his grip and spun in the air as it rocketed towards the lancer. Artoria sidestepped the sword with practiced ease as it shot past the woman. Gordon rushed towards her, sweeping his right hand through the snow and hurling it upwards. Chanting under his breath, the snow hovered for a moment before it rushed towards the lancer, both on the ground and in the air as a trail of spikes. The ice rushed towards the servant and had them stare down at it. With her seemingly distracted, Gordon called out with his hand and prompted his sword to cease its spin and return to his grasp, the return voyage aimed at striking the lancer at least. Artoria glanced down at the ice, then snorted once at the obvious distraction. She stamped her foot down onto the ground just before the ice could reach her and flexed her mana once more, unleashing a pulse which shattered the spell and sent fragments of the frozen attack flying back the way they had come. "Clever," Artoria remarked in a toneless voice as she turned and swung upwards, parrying the flying greatsword away from her and back into the sky. Gordon widened his eyes and stepped backwards as she turned back to face him and launched herself forwards. "Clever won't beat me." The greatsword slammed into Gordon's hands and not but a second later it was already clashing with the spear of Artoria. The woman shoving the saber back and then forcing him down, Gordon grit his teeth behind his helmet as he found his knees creaking with the more force being applied to his guard. His right hand pressed against the other end of the sword to try and grant himself more strength. In response, Artoria slowly raised her right hand at an insultingly slow pace. The gauntlet pressed down against the cone head of the spear as the woman applied more pressure to the push. The grinding of the weapons against one another only intensified further as Artoria pushed down with renewed vigor, Gordon fighting back the strain in his arms that demanded he surrender to the woman. Stepping forwards and leaning down, Artoria pushed onto the saber. Gordon's legs gave out from underneath him and forced him to drop down onto his knees. The saber straining against the servant, the dragon-shaped helmet glaring down at him. With another grunt, Artoria shoved the saber onto his back. Gordon groaned as he braced the sword with both hands, still fighting to keep the lancer from fully pinning him to the ground. "Ha!" Artoria didn't so much as turn her head in the direction of the cry. She'd sensed the return of the blonde saber for a few moments already, aside from already suspecting the woman would try and return as well. Though she had little reason to be concerned about the saber. Not even taking her eyes off Gordon, she expelled magical energy from her body with a single pulse. Gordon was pushed further into the ground as a result of the attack and released a pained grunt. Artoria briefly stepped back and swung her spear upwards, colliding with the crimson sword of the saber for a moment and then batting her aside with almost frightful ease. The blonde woman twisted it in the air before landing back onto the ground and shot forwards without a moment of hesitation, spinning her body around in a corkscrew as she returned to build up power in the slash. With her final spin, she swung over the top of her head and down towards the lancer. Artoria raised the side of her spear, blocking the attack and shifting her body slightly. Then raised up her right foot and stomped down hard onto Gordon's gut as the saber looked as though he was going to make a move. The knight coughed out in pain as his armor made a groaning sound from the sudden attack. Nero jolted in surprise, her eyes flashing to the downed saber for a swift moment. It was all Artoria needed. Shoving the lance forwards, she directed the sword to the side and then stepped in close. Driving the butt of the spear into Nero's gut with a meaty thud, the Emperor coughed out a lungful of air from the strike, soon followed by Artoria slamming her armored shoulder into the side of her head. Nero stumbled backwards, the spear being swept back across in a single powerful motion and battering the sword to the opposite side, breaking whatever guard she might have put up. The right arm of Artoria was thrown forwards in a lightning-fast jab directly into her gut and staggering her backwards once more. Nero coughed out, breathing in and out to try and resume her flow of magical energy. Not that Artoria allowed her a single moment of recovery, or Gordon for that matter. Spinning on her heel, Artoria lashed out with her left leg and kicked the floored saber in the side of the head with a hefty clang. The saber's head snapped to the side and rolled over with the strike. Turning once more, Artoria stomped towards Nero as she brought her sword up, breathing heavily in and out and her face twitching with pain. Her slight waver on her leg proved that she was still feeling the effects of the repeated gut punches. The Emperor let out a cry as she stepped forwards, sweeping her sword towards the lancer. Artoria responded in kind, the two weapons flashing through the air as the servants clashed once more. This time, however, Artoria did not even attempt to humor Nero's attempts. Forcing the Emperor back with each swing of the lance, making full use of the ample supply of magical energy she was receiving from her master. Each swing of the spear released an explosion, Nero being sent staggering with more and more burn marks accumulating on the saber. A galloping sound reached her ears, her head twitched to the side for a moment before she dismissed it. My hand, bind my foes, take my flesh and my bones, fashion the prison to hold the wolf of the ends. She paused at the influx of magical energy. With a final swing she sent Nero skywards as she whirled around to see the saber bringing his sword down onto his right hand. With a single motion, the saber cleaved through his forearm and dropped the severed limb to the ground. Gordon let out a cry of pain, soon shifting into a hiss as he swung his stump around madly and spread as much blood over the snow as he could. Arm of chains. The blood glowed for a brief moment, then snaked towards the lancer. The severed arm spasmed and rippled as the fingers bent and cracked before they shot forwards. The digits elongating and twisting until they formed long tendrils of light, racing towards the lancer and wrapping around her limbs. Artoria widened her eyes as she felt the grip of the tendrils harden considerably, her right arm now unable to move as the blood started to form similar-looking vines of light and raced towards her legs. The lancer responded quickly. Such trickery will not hold me, she announced, bringing up her spear with her left hand and shooting it forwards. The beam of light struck Gordon in the chest and sent him ragdolling away. Her left arm snapped to the side as the chains of light caught hold of the limp and dragged her slightly. Her armor creaked as it was pulled to the side, more and more of the blood splatters glowed a brilliant white before they shot towards her, their forms solidifying and clanging as they formed the distinct shape of chains. Artoria growled as she pulled at them, finding little in the way of purchase even as she used all her strength to do so. With an irate snarl, she sucked in the magical energy around her, activating her dragon core and preparing for a single burst of mana to shatter her prison. As if sensing her intent, the chains tightened their hold considerably to the point her armor was starting to creak in protest of the vice-like grip. Another chain fell around her neck, pulling her backwards and trying to draw her to the ground. Artoria twisted her body, bracing herself and fighting back against the movements. It wouldn't be long before someone got back up and then she would be immobile. An easy victim for them, she would have to break free before that. A loud neigh caught her ears. She had barely a moment to notice the roar of hoofbeats against the ground before her body was rammed into by a stampeding crystalline horse. The chains around her came loose with the impact as she was sent spinning through the air, Rongomyniad dropping from her grip and falling to the floor. The lancer turned to face her attacker only to see the mount bereft of its rider. The horse glowed for a moment before it purposefully shattered, the explosion of the summon sending Artoria flipping through the air once more before she crashed into the snow with a heavy thud. The lancer was quick to shoot back to her feet, clambering up and whirling her head around to see where her attacker was. Already recalling her spear back to her via their link. His name was Tarkus. She heard the voice behind her as barely a whisper, the voice bereft of emotions. Artoria whirled around, already swinging her right fist towards the speaker before her body halted its movements with a jerk. Blood splattered onto the snow and her armor cracked. She stared down at her attacker, the left side of their face caked with dried blood and their eyelid firmly clenched shut. The white hair which had once been pristinely cared for was carelessly draped over the servant's shoulders as a tangled mess, parts fused together with the blood stains on her cheeks. Only their right eye was visible as it looked back at her. Not an ounce of rage in the sapphire blue orb, simply resolution. Artoria's head trailed downwards, her expression hidden behind her helmet as she stared at the long black greatsword pierced right through her chest and into her heart. It was probably more a case of luck on the part of her killer than skill. She recognized this sword as having belonged to the Black Knight earlier, judging by the way the weapon was already fading away into golden motes of light, he was dead already. Her head rose once more, staring at the servant in silence as she waited for her to speak again. "In my name, is Marie Antoinette," the rider declared, stepping away from Artoria with a slight stagger, showing just how much she had been relying on the greatsword to keep herself upright. "Queen of France." Artoria stared back silently, then released a single huff. "Is that so?" Her voice did not waver, even as she felt blood rising in the back of her throat. "To think I would be killed by someone such as yourself," she commented, staggering back slightly and looking down as the greatsword vanished completely, blood already dripping out of the open wound in her chest and down the front of her armor. Artoria's lip twitched upwards, not that the French queen would have noticed it. A decent effort for a queen who saw no combat, she complimented honestly, looking back to the monarch and offering a single nod of the head. "You earned this victory." Marie didn't respond to her, merely continued to pant in and out as she fixed her single eye on the lancer. Artoria did not once waver in her posture, even as the golden motes started to float from her body. The lancer died on her feet. Calamate swung forwards, slamming his fist into Stahl's head and throwing the berserker into a backwards roll. Several bursts of red light struck the side of his body, or would have had his magic resistance not intercepted them first. Though it was a distraction enough to bring the dragon's attention onto his attacker. He was greeted by the sight of Olga springing parallel to him, her arm outstretched with another flash of light building up at the tips of her fingers. Even without doing any damage to him, she could still provide something that could occupy his attention. Calamate took a single step forwards before he paused his movements. "Artoria and Akal are dead," he bluntly commented with a voice devoid of emotion. "I see." He exhaled, "I can only hope they were able to slay others in turn." Shaking his head, he looked towards Olga and raised his right hand towards her. He let out a sharp gasp as he staggered forwards, his crimson red eye flashed towards the blue sword jutting out the front of his shoulder before he stumbled backwards as it was pulled free of his body. Both Olga and Calamate turned their heads in the direction of the weapon, jubilation in Olga's case as she saw the approaching shape of Sigurd, Cu and Brynhildr. Calamate stood firm, not appearing cowed by the appearance of the additional servants in the least. "Dragon Slayer," was the simple greeting that Calamate offered Sigurd. "Calamate." Sigurd nodded back, his tone curt but still respectful. A beat, then Calamate flashed a black sword into existence and dropped it from his left hand, his body twisting sideways and throwing his right arm forwards. Sigurd widened his eyes as he recognized the stance the dragon had taken on. Difficult not to, given that it was his own. The moment Calamate's fist hit the pommel of the sword, Sigurd's feet were already carrying him into a roll. The sword rocketed past Sigurd like a missile, shooting off into the distance as another sword was flashed into the dragon's hands. His right hand was slung forwards, unleashing a wave of fire from his palm that scattered the servants in all different directions to avoid being caught in it. Cu rolled forwards, throwing up a combination of his own runes to counter the dragon. Calamate didn't so much as flinch as the darts of fire splashed along his armored skin, the dragon more focused on charging down Sigurd and Brynhildr. He paused at the last moment, turning around and raising up his sword in a guard as Stahl's axe slammed into it. The berserker swung his body forwards as he dragged both weapons down, thrusting the face of the shield into Calamate and jostling him with the shove. Calamate snarled back in response, hunching his body forwards and spreading his wings out. With a single powerful wingbeat akin to a crack of thunder, Calamate's shoulder barged Stahl back the way he had come and this time forced the berserker into a stumble. Sweeping his left arm out, the dragon parried the shield to the side and threw open a gap in the berserker's guard. His right hand came up and crashed into the armored chin of Stahl, their left hand already being thrown forwards. Brynhildr threw her spear into the dragon's back. Calamate let out a grunt as he twitched with the blow, the movement long enough for Stahl to sweep their shield forwards and slam it into the side of Calamate's right leg and bring his body down onto one knee. Stahl swung up from the opposite side, the back of the great axe moving towards his head. Calamate lashed out, clamping his hand around the pole of the berserker and halting him. With a roar, the dragon surged to his feet while pulling the golem around with him, lifting Stahl off the ground and slinging him around and into the air, hurling the berserker towards Olga and the others. Cu darted forwards, wrapping his arm around the waist of the director and launching the pair of them to safety as the berserker crashed into the ground where they had been standing. Brynhildr jumped onto Calamate's back, her hands wrapping around her spear once more and twisting it, eliciting a pained grunt from the dragon before he swung his elbow back, catching the lancer in the side with the attack and punting her away from him. His vision whited out as Sigurd leapt up and swung his arm down into the side of his face. The punch sent Calamate into a stumble as the saber rushed forwards once more, bringing forth Graham and thrusting it into the leg of the dragon. Calamate snarled in pain, swinging his hand forth and towards the head of the saber. The blow missed as Sigurd ducked down underneath it and rolled back, freeing his sword from the dragon and shooting to his feet before tossing the weapon up and punching it towards the dragon like an arrow. Goo! Graham struck him in the gut, piercing through his body and out the back. This time, when Sigurd recalled the sword, Calamate clamped his right hand around the weapon, ignoring the lancing pain that went through his hand as the sword sliced into his flesh, and stopped it before it could be pulled back. Bringing his leg up, he stomped down and unleashed a wave of fire around the impact point. Sigurd made to jump back to avoid the flames. Calamate's mystic eye flashed once and his body locked up. The wall of fire slammed into him. With a hiss the saber was bodily slammed into the ground by the attack as the mustard yellow fire washed over his body. Calamate had no chance to take advantage of this, however, as his head snapped to the side and his arm came away from Graham. Brynhildr dropped down in front of him and swung up, slicing into his collarbone with her spear and jolting him backwards. Twirling the spear, she then thrust it forwards into his chest before unleashing a burst of violet flames into his wound. With a hiss, Calamate swung his left arm forwards in a fist. The woman leaned back just enough that his knuckles passed just in front of the tip of her nose before overshooting. The woman pried the spear from his gut and shot backwards with a quick step, sweeping her hand upwards and carving a line of symbols into the air. Calamate looked down, seeing the same set of symbols on his chest flash brilliantly before they exploded in a mixture of lightning, fire and ice. The dragon was blasted back with the combination, shards of his scales sent flying away from his body and the feeling of pain now more present than ever. In spite of all of that, ha 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 ha, this is the greatest fight of my life. He had no complaints. Both his hands swung forwards, his palms struck one another with a clap like a cannon. The remnants of flame and ice still clinging to his body were banished with the immediate shockwave. Even the servants themselves had to take a single step backwards with the force of the clap. Bringing his arms back to his side, Calamate cast a glance over those in front of him and cracked a savage grin. Looking around, the dragon then noticed the additional servants making their way towards him, those who had been present in other locations as well. It was very quickly turning into a considerably disadvantageous situation for him, not that he so much as showed an ounce of care for it. With a mighty roar, Calamate threw his head back while thrusting his arms out at his side, his muscles tensed while magical energy swirled around him in a golden hue. The vortex stretched upwards before the dragon hunched himself forwards and fell into a sprint, rocketing across the battlefield in the direction of Olga while pulling his fist backwards. Even as he slung it forwards, he could see the armored servant moving to intercept him, its shield arm extending forwards to catch the blow before it could reach their master. CU himself was in the process of throwing the director behind himself and moving to bring up his staff. So Calamate did the unexpected, he stomped down just shy of the trio and then kicked backwards, shooting away like a rocket. The dumbfounded expressions on Olga and CU were imprinted into the dragon's memories as he twisted his head around to the servant he had sensed sneaking up on him. Sure enough, he found himself staring up at the face of the pouncing shadow tiger. Slamming his shoulder into its lower jaw with an explosion of brilliant yellow flames, the large beast was shunted to the side, its upper saber tooth being blasted from its jaw and into a fall. Alsana on its back was bucked off, letting out a sharp gasp as she fell down and noticed that she was now in line of sight with the black dragon. His left hand flashed as the obsidian sword was crafted in his palm, the dragon already mid-swing when its form was completed, the arc of the attack poised to split the caster in half. Not so fast. His sword was shattered into shrapnel, the hammer which had struck them continued on its path unabated and cracked against his lower jaw with a deafening thud that had Calamate's ears ring. He stumbled backwards, already trying to right his balance when he noticed himself falling towards the singed form of Sigurd. The saber swung his left arm forwards and struck Calamate's opposing cheek, sending him falling back the way he had came. Thrusting a foot out, Calamate stopped himself only to have Brynhildr land a two-footed tackle on the back of his head. He jerked with the movement, Leto was in front of him with a flash of movement once more. Dragging the hammer across the ground and kicking up a tsunami of debris as he roared, swinging the weapon upwards and smashing it straight into the larger berserker's face. His legs struck something solid as he fell back, catching on whatever it was and losing his balance completely. His arms waved from side to side in an almost comical fashion as he was tripped up, turning his body and sticking out his hand in an effort to catch himself before he fell. It was a thick root jutting from the earth positioned directly behind his heels that had caught him out. The caster was already in the middle of their follow-up attack. The large bronze axe head of Torin's weapon struck Calamate in the shoulder, a shuddering tremor coursed through his entire body that the weapon quaked, then Torin slung himself forwards and rammed the dragon at an angle, rolling Calamate onto his back. Even as he fell, Calamate was not going to allow more strikes to be landed on him. His palms flashed with brilliant yellow flames, indiscriminately unleashing an inferno from his limbs in whatever direction he happened to be facing as he fell. The cries of alarm were more than enough to convince him that it was working. His wings spread wide from his back, sweeping outwards in a single powerful motion that fanned the flames further, propelling them from his body and in an outwards direction. He beat them downwards, shooting his body back to his feet and whirling around to see which enemy happened to be closest. Stahl struck him with a backhanded swing of his shield. The face of the metal disc cracked against his scales and sent shards of his armored body shooting off into the distance. Calamate responded instantly, swinging his arm forwards and slamming his fist into Stahl's chest, the golem taking a single step backwards. A blizzard washed over the dragon, snuffing out his flames and causing him to raise his arms as thin shards of razor-sharp ice rushed over his body. The dragon blocked off his face as his eyes were subject to the offensive measure. Sigurd charged in, sliding down and sweeping his legs into Calamate's ankles. Stahl rushed forwards and shoulder barged the dragon into a roll. Calamate beat his wings once more to gain height in a jump, launching himself into the air and turning his body to survey the battlefield as he fell back down. His feet hit the snow, his legs bent and his body hunched forwards. "It seems my efforts so far haven't come close to defeating you yet, Olga," Calamate grinned savagely as his left arm burst into flames. "However, I still have more than I can unveil to fight against you with." His boast was accompanied by the formation of another sword in his hands, revering the grip on the weapon. The Chaldeans readied themselves, even as the dragon prepared for his next offensive. More and more servants were gradually making their way towards the battlefield. The distant form of Nero being followed by the now one-armed Gordon moved with great speeds towards the battlefield. Calamate spared them barely a glance before he refocused on the master. "No matter how many of your allies arrive, I will always fight to match them." Calamate roared, the sword ignited with yellow flames as his mystic eyes started to glow. "To think the servant still has this much power." Romani's voice came through the communicator with a tinge of panic to it. "Director, his Saint Graph output is rising even higher. These readings for magical energy are on par with a divine spirit at this point. He did say he was going to try his hardest." Da Vinci commented from behind the doctor. The man made a noise. "You're a biased source at this point." Olga tuned them out as she focused in on Calamate, her mental commands flowing through into Stahl as the mana visibly surrounded the dragon with a golden hue of light, his body glowing amidst the dark backdrop of the night sky. "Here I come, Olga," Calamate roared out, taking a single step forwards and bringing the sword up. "This is where we find out the victor once and for all." And then drove the sword through his own chest. Olga recoiled in surprise, the servant similarly appeared dumbstruck by his actions. However, none was more surprised than Calamate himself. The dragon looked down at the sword in his chest somewhat dumbly, his left hand clenched around the handle. Calamate made a small noise of confusion, then his eyes bulged as he vomited out a mouthful of dark-colored blood onto the snow, wavering on his feet and stumbling back. Wah! His left hand came away from the sword, pulling it from his chest and spilling more blood onto the ground. The dragon stumbled forward with the act, then dropped down onto his knees, his right hand reaching out to catch him before he fell into the snow. "Wah, what did you do?" Olga cried out in a mixture of shock and outrage. "Why on earth would you do that?" Calamate attempted to speak, only to spit more blood out in the process, gurgling his words. "No good." Romani's voice came through the communicator. "His spirit core has been shattered." The man sputtered his words, completely unsure of how he could explain what happened. "He just killed himself. He can't recover from this, even with the Holy Grail that is not in its possession." The calm voice echoed through the winds, the nature of the words were eerie. As if they had been spoken directly into one's ear, not a trace of background noise to be found anywhere. It was as if the planet was silenced the moment the words had been uttered. Then, just behind Calamate, a figure stood. His armor a dark gray steel, a black cloak over his left side and his head staring back at the Chaldeans. His eyes glowed a brilliant white. His right hand had a fading crimson light, the telltale marks of a command seal's activation. The red-haired youth, fair-looking features and looking no older than Fujimaru, stalked around the side of the dragon, ignoring his existence entirely as he came to a stop a short distance from the Chaldeans. The white eyes of the servant flickered from person to person, then fell upon Olga. She shivered and took an instinctive step backwards when the glowing orbs locked onto her body. The red-haired figure smiled slightly, then raised his right hand in greeting. "Congratulations on passing this test, Olga Marie Animosphere." Olga did a double take. What did you say? A test or perhaps a trial, would be more appropriate wording, was put in place for you. You have passed. The redhead nodded once again. "Congratulations." "Stop saying that," Olga snapped. Her eyes flickered to Calamate still on his hands and knees and then to the redhead in rapid succession. She raised a shaky finger, pointing it at the man. Was he your servant or something?" The boy cast a dismissive glance down at Calamate for a moment, meeting the crimson-red eyes and curling his lip down. "No, it was merely the instrument summoned by the Lord Father to act as your obstacle." His gaze returned to Olga. "The trial has been passed, its purpose had been served, so the dragon didn't need to live anymore." Olga fell silent, staring at the boy with complete incomprehension. You summoned him to this era." "The Lord Father summoned it. I acted as an anchor in his stead." The boy corrected. "I was charged with observing your journey. It was necessary to judge your value, therefore a suitable obstacle was selected." He gestured to Calamate. "However, its actions in the form of the kingdom were outside the Lord Father's designs." The expression of the boy warped in pure disgust. "I would have ordered its death days ago, but it served to make them a more vicious attack dog, thus it would ultimately add to the trial. Therefore it was ignored." Olga held up her hands. Wait, she pointed at Calamate. "You summoned him, for me." Then pointed to herself. The words came out as little more than a whisper. The single nod of the person in front of her hammered that truth deep into her. "Yes, to act as your opponent. The initial design was to present you with an insurmountable obstacle and see whether or not you had the will to overcome it." A cordial smile came upon the boy's face. "I am pleased to see that you did. The Lord Father never makes mistakes when he deems the value of a person, unlike another." You, Calamate coughed out, glaring up at the boy. With a grunt of effort, the dragon snarled as he pushed himself back to his feet, staggering about as he struggled to remain upright. The movements only causing more blood to pour forth from the open wound in his chest and dribble down his chin. The dragon took a single shambling step towards the boy. One moment. The boy raised a single finger towards the Chaldeans, then reached for his hip and drew forth a sword that looked very much like coiled steel. The corkscrew-shaped weapon was pointed towards Calamate for a split second before it flashed white. A pulse of light rocketed from the sword, slamming into the dragon and shredding his right side instantly. His arm blasted from his body and his ribs caved as he was ragdolled away. The boy frowned, then sheathed the coiled sword once more, turning his attention upon the stunned Chaldeans. My apologies. I had thought it would die after the command was given. The brutal display it put the servants on edge instantly, all manner of weapons leveled to the boy or spells ready to be primed. In the face of this overwhelming display of force, he remained unmoved. Even as both Nero and Gordon slid to a halt behind the ground, the blonde woman gaping openly as she stared at the dying dragon and then to the individual who had done so with a single wave of their sword. Her eyes narrowed instantly as she moved to Olga's side. Master, what is the situation? When she got no response, she frowned and glanced further along the line. What happened? That is Calamate's master, Torin revealed, his voice toneless as he stared at the boy apprehensively. He summoned the dragon to this era. His voice then dropped into a growl, then ordered his death by his own hand. Nero did a double take, her bewilderment shared by Gordon as the knight whirled on the red head. But then, you just slew him. The boy nodded once more, then looked at Torin with an odd expression. I admit myself to be somewhat puzzled by your aggression. He hummed for a moment, then snapped his fingers in understanding. Ah, this is a similar instance with Canius, is it not? You wished to slay the dragon with your own hands. For his part, the boy's expression shifted somewhat guiltily. I apologize for denying you that. It was merely that the end result was a given at this point in time, so further bloodshed was little more than pandering to the beasts. He jerked his head to Calamate's body, disgusting sense of worth. Torin bristled but remained silent. His eyes darted to Calamate for a moment as the dragon was hacking and coughing, blood pouring from the gaping wound on his body as his head stared in the direction of the caster. He might have hated the dragon, but to die in this sordid way. You, Olga stared at Calamate with wide eyes, then looked to the boy. You used him. The redhead looked back to Olga and nodded once more. I did. However, you phrase it with such an odd emotion as though my actions were wrong. It was inhuman, its values were inhuman, and it was an enemy to humanity. In serving the Lord Father, it was granted a goal that would benefit humanity by raising the spirit of a worthy. Stop that, she snapped back, silencing the boy. Stop saying that. Enough of this test nonsense or this drivel about the Lord Father, just stop talking about it. Her voice dropped into a snarl the longer she spoke. Just shut up. Who are you? The redhead frowned lightly. I am a subject of the Lord Father. I had a name before I was blessed, but such a thing does not matter anymore. I am a child of. No. Sigurd's voice came out curt and clipped. You are more than that. He shifted his posture. I see the soul grafted onto that body, stringing them around like a puppet. You speak of this, Lord Father, as though he is not present, but he is, aren't you? The lenses of wisdom are not to be underestimated. I see. Sigurd. The boy responded with a tilt of the head. It is true, the Lord Father lives within me, his soul embraces my mind and soothes my body. He is indeed here as of this moment, though I am nothing more than a messenger. He paused for a moment. Though if it would make you more comfortable, you might address this body as Arlino. That was his name from when he was lesser than I. Turning his head skywards, he frowned slightly. Perhaps we shall not have the chance to speak further. The ground shook for a moment, a deep rumbling akin to an earthquake were it not for the fact that every single one of Olga's instincts was screaming at her. He has foolishly awoken the scourge, Arlino bluntly commented, then turned his attention towards Olga once more. However, the Lord Father offers you this prize for your success, and he awaits the time when you might speak in person. He has marked you as one of the blessed. His lips pulled into a gentle smile. A great honor. The cloak on his left side came away, unveiling the familiar shape of the Holy Grail in his hand. With an almost casual toss, the person flung the golden chalice towards them. The moment he did so, he vanished as though he had never been there in the first place. The Grail thudded into the snow and sat there for a moment. Olga broke into a sprint, already moving towards the downed body of Calamate as the dragon stared up at the sky. Sliding to a halt next to him, she opened her mouth to speak but found no words on the tip of her tongue. After seconds of staring slack-jawed at the dragon, she clamped her mouth shut with an audible click. My dream, never mattered, Calamate whispered out as he stared skywards. My ideals, my struggles, all of it, just a test, for you. I didn't know. Olga replied back, not knowing what else she could say. I gathered as much. Calamate choked out. his body flickering between transparency. You do not seem the type. He twisted his head to the director. Is Vinci there? The screen flashed up, Romani ranting about something in the background while Da Vinci's face took up the screen. Yeah, the woman spoke through, looking down at him. Yourself. Excuse me, you painted yourself. Calamate croaked out, watching as the woman stared at him in silence for a moment, then a gentle smile came upon her lips. Was I right? Yes. Da Vinci nodded once. I painted a portrait of this face. Hey, another bubble of blood burst in his mouth. Kill me. Olga blinked, not registering the words for a few moments before they settled like lead in her mind. What? I do not want to die. To him, his eyes looked up at the director. So, kill me. I can accept it, if you are the one who. The woman stared down at him for a moment, then pulled her lips into a thin line. All right, she declared in a steeled tone of voice, stepping to one side and allowing Stahl to take her place next to the dragon. The great axe in his hand slowly rising upwards above the golem's head. Calamate closed his eyes, letting his head fall back onto the snow almost gently as if he was taking a quick rest. Do you think I could have won? Maybe. That's good. Calamate exhaled. I don't. How do you beat someone who can command the sky to their will? Olga's lip quivered slightly before it tightened itself. She shouldn't really be feeling anything more than satisfaction at the idea of defeating a threat to human history such as this. Yet the victory tasted like ash in her mouth. The axe fell. Olga jolted at the thudding sound and the cracking of bone, though she did not look away. Her eyes remained locked onto the body of the berserker as he started to fade away into golden motes of light, barely paying attention to all the other noises that were currently ongoing behind her. Eyes still locked onto the diminishing silhouette of the servant. She didn't understand half of what was being said to her. No, that wasn't true. She understood it perfectly. This entire thing had been a setup from the very beginning. Someone watching her specifically put all this together as some sort of trial for her to perform in. She spent the entire singularity dancing to someone else's strings. This era was never in any real danger from the get-go, it had all been about watching her. The only real thing about this had been the ambition of Calamate. His desires were genuine and they weren't even the intention of his master. His goal had been impossible in every sense of the word, his fate had already been decided. And the moment he no longer held value, he was tossed aside by the summoner as if they were nothing more than trash. Olga didn't know how to feel about that, she didn't even know what she was supposed to feel about it. Everything of the last few minutes had gone from being incredibly simple to exceedingly complicated and she didn't know where to begin with any of it. Emergency ray shift back here, Romani's voice echoed out, snapping the woman from her musings as his voice was frantic at this point. Director, we've confirmed retrieval of the Grail but you have to get back here now. The interference around London is gone and Fujimaru-kun is. Confirmed summoning of Lancelot, Scathach and Cu Chulain to London. A voice behind Romani called out in alarm, klaxon alarms blared out, readings consistent with the output has jumped once more. Saint graph output increase no. The quantity of Saint graphs is increasing. 2,000, 5,000, 7 what? We just exceeded 10,000 and still climbing. The voice which belonged to Carrie cried out in shuddering terror, the readings are noble phantasm activation confirmed. Incoming space-time quake. What? Romani cried out in alarm. Olga barely registered the words before she felt the earth shudder around her once more, much like what had occurred last time. What about the container? It keeps cycling through every class we have. Munier called out in alarm, it's not there long enough to confirm summoning of Arash to London. What? Olga muttered out, turning her head to look at the communicator. What is? No time to talk, Romani quickly exclaimed, we're retrieving you right now. We're trying to establish contact with Fujimaru-kun but it's, he cut himself off, rapidly shaking his head, you can worry about that when you get back. Activating ray shift. Olga's hands were already glowing before the doctor had even finished speaking, the woman staring down at her palms in surprise before she looked back to the servants around her, all of whom looked as stunned as she did at the torrent of words that had flowed out of the screen. Brynhildr found herself staring at her glistening hands in alarm, then turned her focus on Sigurd in horror. Sigurd. I am. Worry not, Brynhildr. The saber spoke to her as her form turned more transparent. As sure as the sun rises every morning, my love for you will guide my way to your side. Olga ignored the sappy display, still watching as the servants she had similarly contracted in the singularity itself were being pulled along with her, Romani probably doing so accidentally or whatever was the case. Either way, she didn't have a chance to contemplate it. What? She, along with the servants she contracted, vanished in a haze of golden light, not even granted the chance to get a final word in. And we're done. Off to London. Back to regular uploads. Chapter 143, The Stranger's Hand. Ritska glanced out of the corner of his eye as he stood next to Mash, awaiting the call that they could enter the coffins. He could already see Ash glaring at Sullivan. Even if he didn't, the blonde saber was making his hatred rather noticeable to the point where it would have been impossible not to realize that Ash was actively glaring at Sullivan. Despite what he said in terms of teamwork, he was already having second thoughts about this sort of thing. "Are you alright, Senpai?" Mash asked, clearly noticing his slight discomfort. The boy flashed her a somewhat strained smile in an effort to provide some reassurance to her. The fact that her face remained unchanging for a second and then seemed to worsen was proof enough that it hadn't worked in the least. The same vanished from Ritska's face, replaced by an exhausted frown. "I won't say I'm feeling particularly confident about this line-up," he replied to the shielder with a jerk of his head behind them. "Especially considering who we're actually bringing along with us." Mash glanced over Ritska's shoulder, quickly taking notice of Ash's heated glare and Sullivan's oblivious nature to it. Or he wasn't oblivious and didn't actually care in the least, Mash wasn't personally all that sure. She hadn't engaged in enough conversations with Sullivan to actually get an understanding of what he was like. What little she did know, at the very least, told her that he valued his own opinions above that of everyone else. So it might have been that he was just ignoring Ash entirely. In truth, she could already start to see the issues that might arise with an extended expedition with the group. Jean had already brought the topic up and Ritska had addressed it as neutrally as he could. Mash herself wasn't going to question his decision on that front. It was hardly as though she could say it didn't make sense to have more servants used to working with one another. However, bringing enemies together on the same team, that was something Mash couldn't quite wrap her head around. They might have the same goal in helping Chaldea undo the incineration, but at the same time the two couldn't stand one another. She paused for a moment, a thoughtful frown coming upon her face as she considered something. She already knew how Ash felt about Sullivan. He hadn't bothered to make it a secret and advocated his distrust on every single opportunity that arose, but Sullivan hadn't made his own opinion about Ash all that public beyond the occasional insult. It wasn't like whenever Sullivan talked about Gwyndolin, it was more as though the words to describe it didn't quite emerge in her mouth. "Mash," the girl jolted, noticing Ritska giving her a curious look, "You okay?" "Fine, Senpai." Mash nodded her head up and down. "I was just thinking about something, is all." She paused, tilting her head slightly and furrowing her brows. "Do you think that Ash-san and Sullivan-san will be able to work as a team?" Ritska's brows rose up slightly. "Well, I mean," he coughed slightly, moving his right hand to scratch the back of his neck. "It would be ideal, but I'm not entirely sure that's going to happen anytime soon." The blunt admittance had the girl start with a surprise, her eyes widening as she stared at Ritska. But some people just have differences, Mash, but can still work well together," Ritska pointed out, raising a single finger. "Like Captain Drake and Ash." His lip twitched upwards. Pretty much everyone knew how much Ash hated her, but in the end they still worked together because they had a common goal. "I mean," he gestured to himself, "I'm not expecting to wind up as Havel's best friend or something." His words descended into an amused laughter towards the end of his sentence, "but we still work together." Mash opened her mouth before she closed it. "I see." A nod. "Then it is more a professional relationship you are trying to make than a personal one?" she inquired, earning a nod of the head from the master. "Way I see it, we're going to be working with all sorts of people in the coming weeks and months," he explained, "so it wouldn't make much sense to travel down with the exact same set of people each time. Servants all have different skills that are suited to different conditions. Like in Okeanos when we brought down Vrindari to help set up traps for Heracles." Mash made a noise of understanding. "Ah, I get it." She gave a single nod of the head. "Some servants might be required for different tasks, so you're trying to get them to work with each other to complete those tasks." "Right, pretty much, yes," Ritska confirmed. "It's more trying to get everyone under the mentality of, we're all here for the same job, so let's make sure it gets done correctly, sort of deal." HMPH. The pair of them turned to the floating purple robe of Medea, the caster hovering slightly to the right of them and coming away from inspecting the opened coffin. As ideal as that would be, there are some that you would find it difficult to even have with one another in a professional environment. She looked to Ritska. Do you not have a servant who despises mages present? Ritska nodded his head in a wince. Why yeah, Havel. And I am a witch. Medea bluntly pointed out, her lips remaining in a thin line. How long do you imagine it would be before he made clear his hatred of myself? Ritska and Mash shared a glance with one another before they returned their attention back to Medea. That is, Mash raised her hand, then slowly lowered it, but Havel-san is working with Senpei. She hastily added on, and he dislikes dragons. Kiyohime-san hasn't reported a problem yet and Havel-san worked with Senpei. Is the former not because the berserker has made an avoid the dragon girl at all costs? Medea raised an eyebrow behind her hood, her tone of voice already making it apparent she knew the answer to that. Ritska frowned slightly but didn't say anything. Still, far be it from me to diminish the power of blind optimism. She curtly dismissed it with a twitch of her lip. If you intend to see the best in all you encounter, then that is your own choice. The intercom buzzed over their heads, Romani's voice echoing out above them. Coordinates are all set, Fujimaru-kun. Climb into the coffin when you're ready. Ritska and Mash glanced up before the former returned his attention to Medea, staring at her for a moment before he chuckled and shrugged his shoulders. I mean, I'm not going to say that I believe everyone can be friends or something. He admitted as he walked around the caster and towards his coffin. The container hissed as the lid jutted forth and then swung open. The boy stopped just shy of stepping into it, looking over his shoulder at Medea. But I'd like to give everyone the chance to show they can work together. He stepped into the coffin, turning himself around and looking to her. Considering that you all came for the exact same reason, I'd like to think that you all want to see us succeed. So giving you the chance to do that is the least I can do. He paused for a moment, then hummed as he leaned back. Besides, trying to work together and failing is a little better than never trying in the first place. At least that's what I think. Medea stared at him in silence for a brief moment. As I said, far be it from me to dismiss the power of blind optimism. I'm sure experience will rob you of that notion soon enough. Despite her words, Ritska noticed the slight inclination of her lip upwards. Although for the time being, I suppose faith in the best qualities of mankind is hardly something to scoff at. Considering what we're all fighting for, I'd like to think so. Ritska responded with a wry tone as the coffin door started to close. Starting unsummoned program, the automated voice boomed above their heads. The group of servants shifted their gaze upwards and stared at the glowing lights above them as their surroundings slowly shifted, their bodies being engulfed in a bright light. Initiating Spiritron conversion. Ray shift commencing in 3, 2, 1. As with most ray shifts before, Ritska had been expecting a brief shunt before he would find himself standing in whatever location he was being sent to. At least preferably, sometimes, with disturbing frequency, he would note, he would find himself falling through the air towards the ground. By intention or design or perhaps just a fault, Ritska was slowly starting to get the idea that gravity was going to become one of his natural enemies. However, there was something about the shuddering jolt that went through his body moments before the ray shift activated that left him feeling a sense of dread. Something more than the notion that Ash and Sullivan might start a fight with one another. Then his coffin flashed with life and he was away to the era. The first thing Ritska felt the moment he made landfall was a deep biting cold which spread across his entire body in an instant. He ragdolled down as he lost his footing and fell face first into the ground. A gentle crunch beneath his feet and a burning sensation swept across his exposed skin in an instant. His face went numb from whatever he was currently lying in. For him the very act of rushing back to his feet was something that took all his effort. Of course, the moment he managed to get up he was very nearly blown down once more as a rush of wind slammed into his body, the master taking a single step backwards and letting out a startled gasp as he foot sunk into the ground. Ritska couldn't think straight. Between the burning across his body and the lack of vision he was running through every single possibility of what was happening to him before he lost the sense of touch in his hands. Despite that, he could still raise his arms and hold them out in front of him to cover his face. His eyelids slammed shut as the same burning sensation that currently assaulted his body rushed into his exposed orbs. It was only when he parted his arms slightly and cracked an eye open that he managed to get some semblance of understanding as to where he was actually located and what was likely going on. Shifting his head downwards, he found his vision consumed with a rushing white haze, as though he was stepping through a fast-flowing river with all the specks surging past his body. Even his black trousers barely stood out amongst the backdrop. his feet vanishing below into whatever he was stood upon. In his pain-addled haze, he could barely string more than two thoughts together as he became aware of the lack of sensation. For a brief terrifying moment, he was reminded of the coldness of the dark sign branded on his body. It had only been for a few minutes, but he remembered it well. The complete lack of sensation in his own body, as if moving your limb and being surprised when it did so. As though he was going through the motions. This wasn't that. He could take comfort in the fact he was still feeling pain. Something a small part of him was grateful for, as it meant that he was still alive. A larger part of him wanted to stop feeling it altogether. A howling noise split the air. For a brief moment Ritska believed it to be an animal. His head darted up and found himself unable to see anything in front of him either. Unsurprisingly, if he couldn't see his legs, then seeing anything in front of his face wasn't going to be something he was capable of either. A rather obvious thought with the benefit of hindsight, but in his own defense, he was hardly thinking straight. The howling grew louder before Ritska felt his entire body shoved backwards by an invisible force, as though he'd been struck by a transparent car. The howl rushed over his head as the master was knocked down into the floor, his body sinking into the white crunchy substance beneath him. "Ah, snow," Ritska muttered to himself, willing his body to move once more to pull himself out, but ultimately failing to muster so much as an ounce of his strength. He'd been ray-shifted directly into a blizzard. A rather nasty one as well. Ritska stared towards what he presumed was the sky, but in truth he couldn't see anything. He was just vacantly looking as his body lay in the chilled grip of the snow around him. Every breath he attempted to take was ripped right from his lungs, his mouth half frozen shut as the moisture on his skin started to crystallize. It must have been quite cold for that to happen. He wondered if Mash was all right. She was a demi-servant, so her endurance was better than his, but at the same time she was still alive. Would she be feeling the same sort of horrible stuff that he was right now? He didn't want that. What would happen to her if he died? No, he couldn't think about that. He wouldn't let that happen. He couldn't die now, not with so many people counting on him. Pulling as much strength as he could gather from every ounce of his body, Ritska heaved himself up with all the power he could. His adrenaline burned his body through and through, swinging his body to the side and sweeping his arm out, slamming it into the snow and using it to brace himself as he further twisted his body. He ignored his hands protesting and his fingers feeling as though they were going to drop off. Hissing out of breath, spitting onto the snow, he brought his left hand out from underneath him and pressed it down. Shoving his body up in a press-up before giving a single grunt of exertion as he propelled himself up, pushing the ground away and rocking on his knees. He couldn't die yet. He didn't want to die yet. Whatever energy had let him climb to his knees was starting to leave him at this point. No. Rather, it was as though his body had drained itself of any further power. His muscles went slack and his arms fell to his side, his eyelids struggled and fluttered as Ritska found himself increasingly unable to keep them open. His back to the wind, it was subject to the howling gale and fast-moving shards of ice. The master was quite certain that he could feel sections of his clothing getting shredded, given that he actually felt warmth spreading through his back for a brief moment before it too started to depart. The muscles which kept his head upright failed. Ritska slumped forwards once more into a kneeling position. Intrusive thoughts flooded his mind. If he'd been dropped here of all places, then perhaps it was the world's way of telling him that it was best to give up. In fact, he couldn't remember why he had been struggling so hard in the first place. The entire planet had been incinerated in a second by someone who was apparently the best mage to ever exist. What hope did he actually have in the first place? None. He was just some kid who was brought in to fill the empty seats. He wasn't like Mash, who held the power of a servant, nor was he like Ash, who had apparently saved his world already. He was a literal nobody amongst a sea of brilliance. Would it really make that big a difference if he just sat here and let the cold claim him? Initially he had been thrust into the role because there was no one else, but the director had come back and she had been able to go to the Roman Singularity with them. So he wasn't actually the only one available. In that case, did it really matter all that much? The director was an actual mage. She was definitely going to be a lot better at this stuff than him, so he was sure it would work out in the end. They didn't need him. He could just sit here and let the cold claim him. Besides, he could feel himself getting used to it. The biting winds had fallen down into a pleasant chill. His body didn't feel like it was going to crumble away at any moment, but at the same time he didn't feel the compulsion to move anywhere. Sitting here and taking a short nap in the snow wouldn't be such a bad thing, would it? Like hell. What was he thinking at a time like that? His eyes snapped open once more, a growl left his lips as he pulled his legs out of their kneeling position and into a crouch. As if in response to his sudden burst of determination, the freezing winds intensified, the howling around him heralding the approach of another gale force impact. Not that Ritska was going to be deterred now. Sitting down in the snow and just leaving everyone like that, what was he even doing considering that in the first place? Mash still had to see the sky. Tisk. Ritska sucked air into his lungs, his throat burned as though he'd swallowed an ice cube, a splitting pain lanced straight through his skull and into his brain as he felt his head throb. He wasn't cowed by it, instead he responded by practically jumping up onto his feet, throwing himself into shambling steps. His feet came in and out of the snow, each movement felt as though he was ripping his leg out of the ground itself before nailing it back down. The snow seemed determined to take hold of his limbs and never release them. Ritska rebelled against that grip with each step he took, driving his feet down into the snow like a nail and yanking them free with a grunt. Ritska didn't care how many steps he had managed, in an ironic twist they each had been so full of effort that they blended together. All that really mattered to him was that he was moving in the first place. Another howl split the sky, the boy didn't turn around. He felt it though, even before the wind struck he could tell this was going to be the most powerful blast yet. The rumbling around him and the fact he saw the icy debris around him start to rush away from him as fast as they could. The boy didn't care, he just kept moving, all that mattered was that he kept moving forwards. The howl was like a thundering roar now, as if raging against his resistance. Taking a final step forwards, Ritska turned his body around to face it. He could see the cloud of white rushing towards him like a tidal wave, watching in slow motion as the upper layers of snow were ripped away from the ground and into the oncoming wall. He didn't let his fear show, instead he just stared at the icy tsunami in silence as it approached, ready to knock him down and bury him. He angled his body forwards, bracing himself and raising his arms. He wouldn't give up that easily, until the last moment. He wasn't going to give up his will to survive. Not for anything. Perfect sentiments. The gentle whisper was louder than the storms, as if it had been spoken directly into his ear. As if to accompany the words, the oncoming wall of ice split down the center, rushing around the master and along either side of him without slowing down in the least. As though it had been physically repulsed by the mere idea of touching the boy, it continued on its rampage and left the bubble around him untouched. Ritska made a small noise, as best he could with his lips frozen together, and looked around in surprise. His body twisting from side to side and then his head looking up to confirm that what had happened, had in fact happened. The boy wasn't sure how long the haze of snow surrounded him, it might well have been a few seconds but to him it felt as though he was in that bubble for an eternity. Somehow, it was oddly peaceful. As though he'd been plucked right out of danger without moving from his spot, watching the world rush past him without the slightest ounce of being in danger. When the millennium-long seconds ended, the rushing wall of snow diminished into the pale haze of the earlier blizzard. The boy felt his strength leave him, his body teetered forwards and very nearly found himself back onto the snow. Or would have, had he not fallen into something which stopped him completely. Ritska could barely make out the bar which had seemingly sprung out from thin air in front of him and blocked his fall, keeping him standing on his feet. It stretched out across his torso, around the same thickness of his arm. He stared at the silhouette in front of him for a few moments, then traced his eyes along the rest of it in the direction it came from. Quickly coming to the conclusion that it had been an arm, considering the fact he was now staring at a shoulder and soon after that, a featureless head. Well, to him it was featureless. This blizzard still obscured so much that Ritska was sure that he appeared to be little more than a moving shadow to his rescuer. It will not do for you to fall so quickly after making such a proud declaration to defeat the inevitable death that would have awaited you. The whisper had risen into a voice, the words cut clear through the rushing winds around them. Rest for now, I shall take you to safety where we might speak further. I have little doubt that a partnership will serve to benefit both parties. Ritska would have responded if he was able to, but the moment the man had told him to rest it was as though his body lost the energy to carry on. His muscles went slack and his eyelids fell down. Darkness consumed him as he passed into a peaceful slumber. The door burst open, the lock shattered with the shove and sent splinters of wood clattering to the ground. A snow-covered figure was tossed inside, letting out a sharp gasp as they hit the floor but didn't seem to be complaining about the rough treatment they had endured. A second figure stomped in, equally covered in frozen water before they turned around and grabbed a hold of the door. grunting to themselves as they fought back against the gale outside and shoved it closed before holding it there. The head of the figure turned around to look for something, quickly spotting it next to the door. Keeping their right hand pressed firmly upon the entrance, their left hand reached out and took hold of the back of the wooden chair. Wood cried out as the furniture was dragged along the floorboards and towards the door. The tall figure stepped back and pushed the chair forwards, propping it up underneath the door handle and moving back to admire their handiwork. The door rattled as the winds battered against it but remained unmoved. The figure snapped their head to the window to the side of the door, moving towards it and taking hold of the dark curtains and drawing them across. The moment the hands clenched around them, the top layer of fabric shattered like glass as the ice encrusted atop them was disturbed. The man paid no heed to them as he drew them shut and the room fell into darkness. All that could be heard was the rattling of the door and the unending whistle of the winds from outside the building. The figure thrown onto the floor let out a shuddering gasp. Their hands flew to their mouth and cupped over it as they breathed in and out repeatedly to get warmth back into their fingers. They shot a glance towards the man still standing by the door. Their vague outline raised their left hand once more and spread their palm wide. Light burst from their hand, a flickering bright orange flame floated up and illuminated the room. Decorations were sparse, a single cupboard at the side of the room with a few books upon it, a square oak table with another chair on the opposite side, creaky wooden floorboards and an open doorway leading into another room, presumably the kitchen. The walls of the main room they resided in were plastered up with pale yellow wallpaper, although the cold had already gotten to it with parts peeling away. "Don't suppose you can start a fire, right?" Nobunaga asked from the floor, breathing in and out repeatedly, their breaths visible from the coldness that permeated around them. Even here, there was little escape from the ever-present chill. "In a room full of wood," Ash replied with a dry tone of voice, turning on the smaller woman and frowning. "The cold affects you so greatly." "It shouldn't," Nobunaga responded back with gritted teeth, pulling her hands away from her mouth in order to speak. "We're both servants, the weather shouldn't affect us in the least. Sure, I would get wet if I fell in water, but getting hypothermia from being outside." She scowled heavily, glaring at the rays of light through the curtains. "TCH, magic storm." Ash nodded his head in assent. "I discerned as much." He paused for a moment, glancing at the curtains briefly. "Did you catch sight of anyone else?" Nobunaga was silent before she shook her head. "Just you before you slung me under your arm and went bounding for the nearest building." There was a pause before she cracked a smile. "Quick reactions, by the way. It was prudent to get both of us out of the blizzard as quickly as possible." Ash responded back to her with a clear tension in his words. The apprehension from the saber gave pause to the archer, the woman inclining her head and raising an eyebrow as she resumed breathing on her reddened fingers. "As an unkindled, my senses are muted to the point of being non-existent save for such things as pain. As you said, the weather should have no effect on me." Nobunaga could see where this was going already. "This did," Ash hummed and nodded once, turning to face her once more while keeping the flames near his head. "The only other land I have ever been in which the cold affected me this greatly was the frozen painting of Ariandel." Painting. A world trapped inside a painting. Neat, was all Nobunaga had to say in response to that, glancing around the room before she spotted something in the far corner. "Aha!" she cried out, rushing to her feet and moving towards it with sudden vigor that caught the saber momentarily by surprise. He watched as she crouched down directly in front of a cage built into the wall, grabbing the iron bars and pulling them aside and staring into the blackened-out gap. "Looks like this was a fireplace," she explained to Ash, turning around and looking about the room. "I don't see any occupants, so we're free to smash up the furniture." "If you say so," Ash grunted back, moving forwards and pausing for a moment as he considered something. "If the cold is so effective to either of us, then what of Ritsuka?" Nobunaga was silent for a moment before she responded. "Neither of us have been desummoned yet and only I have independent action." Her voice shifted to be more serious than her usual amused tone of voice. "If Master was dead, then you would have most likely vanished by now. Not to mention we would both be aware if he perished." The woman turned and looked to the saber directly, her face in a more stern expression. "We can therefore assume that he remains alive, however we cannot confirm his safety nor do we have the means of doing so at this time. The blizzard outside is dangerous to even servants such as ourselves, therefore wandering around it in the vain hope that we might stumble upon Master is a fool's errand." Ash frowned. "You suggest we remain here then? You say that as though we have another option available to us." Nobunaga countered as she returned her attention to the fireplace, moving her hand into the midst of it and sweeping aside the cold embers. For the moment, our first course of action should be establishing our own safety before we can worry about our masters. That might seem counterintuitive at the moment, but it serves us better in the long run. She jerked a thumb over her shoulder in the direction of the curtains. If we go out there, we'd probably last about an hour before we died. Maybe less if we get caught in another rush like the one we last experienced. We have no way of knowing where our allies are located, and even if we did, we have no real means of contacting them. Ash blinked. What of the mental? I was trying that while you had me slung under your arm. Nobunaga replied in a strained tone of voice, standing back up and turning to face the saber full, her lips curled into a frown. No response from anyone. That can be for one of two reasons: they are already dead, or there is some sort of interference that blocks out mental communication magic, or along those lines. I see. Nobunaga placed her hands on her hips, raising an eyebrow at the saber. Did you not pay attention during the briefing of the Singularity? The entire region was blanketed in some sort of interference to stop them getting an accurate lay of the land before we arrived. It's hardly presumptuous to believe this would extend to more than just simple observation. Ash hadn't considered that. With the benefit of hindsight, it did make a certain amount of sense to him. His understanding must have been obvious on his face by the way Nobunaga sighed to herself and shook her head from side to side. See, this is why you're a munitions retainer, she explained, pointing to herself. Leave the tactics to the actual general. She lowered her arm. Now, help me smash up the house owner's property so we can set fire to it. The woman looked around. We can think of our next plan after we get warm. I'm also going to raid their food cupboards for supplies. An army cannot march on an empty stomach after all. I do not need to eat. Yeah, but master does. Nobunaga bluntly responded, and if he's getting dragged through a frozen wasteland like this, I would say that keeping his energy up is a must. The last thing we need is him getting lethargic and droopy. Another pause. Your limitless box can store anything, right? It can. Good. We're gonna strip this place down of everything we can get, she bluntly remarked as she walked over to the chair sitting next to the table. Taking it in both hands, she snapped the headrest off it and dropped it to the ground with a thud. Blankets, candles, if they have any, and anything else you can think might come in handy. Probably some more wood for kindling. Ash tilted his head, though before he nodded he opened his mouth and asked, what of the owners? Nobunaga stopped as she went to break off one of the chair legs. Ruby red eyes flickered onto emerald green with incredulity. We were hardly quiet as we came inside, and I'm now smashing up their furniture. Considering how cold it is, I'd wager they're already dead. Probably the same as everyone else in this street. She paused for a moment, then frowned, though that would make our situation worse if the entire population of London was dead. She muttered to herself, then tossed the chair towards Ash. The saber blinked as he cut out of his flames and then caught the remains of the chair in his hands. I'm going to look around the rest of the house. You keep smashing up furniture. Smaller bits that gradually get larger. Ash nodded once before he paused to consider something. Before you leave, he called out to the archer. The woman paused before turning to face him. The saber flicked open his bottomless box and held his hand just above it. Particulates rushed up and formed a shape in his hands. The room brightened up considerably as a lit torch manifested itself in his grasp. The saber twisted his wrist to hold it upright before extending his arm in the direction of his fellow servant. Nobunaga stared at the burning wood for a few moments in silence before she looked at the servant. You can keep actual fire in that thing? Yes. That gets more and more useful each time I see it, she bluntly responded as she took the torch in her hand and held it up, turning her body and moving to the far corner of the room where there was a staircase moving up to the next floor. The wood creaked with each step the archer took. I gotta get me one of those things. I believe Da Vinci was working on one. Ash provided as helpfully as he could as he took a hold of the chair and ripped it apart with a spray of sawdust and splinters. Nobunaga called back to him, she better hurry up then. Her footsteps receding as she climbed higher and higher up the stairs. Gripping the wooden leg of the chair with both hands, Ash brought it down over his knee and shattered it once more, splitting it apart before it was tossed onto the growing pile with a thud. As he worked, the saber called out through the house. Do you believe our allies were able to find cover as well? A safe bet, Nobunaga's voice echoed throughout the silent house. One of them has enough magic resistance that she could walk through this storm without batting an eye. A scoff, X-ranked, that's just ridiculous. Regardless, if we were able to move with enough speed to find shelter, then it is guaranteed they would be able to as well. Ash broke the seat itself. Not that we would be able to tell. Nobunaga continued on, seeing more than a foot in front of your face is impossible out there. We'll likely need to wait for the blizzard to die down, if it ever does, before we could think of going out there again. A pause, either that or wait until Master actually summons us with his command spells. Those things recharge or something, right? I have been told as much, yes. Ash replied back with a grunt, stamping down on the chair once more and breaking it into smaller chunks of wood. He stepped back to admire his handiwork, the remains of the chair thoroughly broken up into assorted fragments of wood of varying sizes. From around the length of his finger to nearing half his forearm. I have witnessed as much. Ritsuka once used one on me when I fell into the ocean. He heard a clatter from upstairs, turning his head directly up and staring at the ceiling. You fell into the ocean? Nobunaga asked back with a clear note of surprise, soon followed by a loud hum. I can see how that would be a problem. You're wearing thick steel armor after all. That does not tend to float all that well. It does not. The servant agreed, returning his attention to the pile and taking hold of it in his arms, marching towards the fireplace with heavy footsteps and dropping down in front of it. Even in the darkness, his eyes had adjusted somewhat to the lack of lighting. Though he quickly remedied the need for adjustment by bringing out his pyromancy flame once more and illuminating the room around him. I take it you can't swim either. I cannot, Ash confirmed, reaching down and taking some of the smaller pieces of wood in his right hand and tossing them into the ash-covered hole. I never learned how. Even if the chance had provided itself, I have little doubt there would be creatures in the water that would kill and eat me. I cannot fight in the water. An amused laughter rippled through the house. You would be hard-pressed to find a servant whose CA, the voice cut off. Ash halted his movements as silence descended through the house. His head tilted slightly as he gradually rose to his feet once more, turning his attention to the staircase directly adjacent to him. Nobunaga, he called out to his ally, already creeping his hand towards his bottomless box to draw forth a weapon. Homeowners won't be a problem. His hand stopped when her voice echoed out once more, accompanied by an apathetic sigh. Like I said, cold got to them. Unfortunate, Ash responded with, moving his hand back to his side and returning to his crouched position. Though unsurprising, Nobunaga grunted back at the saber's voice. I did say it was the most likely outcome. She called back through the house, keeping her attention on the three individuals in front of her. A man with dark brown hair, a middle-aged looking woman and a small child, perhaps around 5 or 6, were huddled just next to the open window. The odd thing the archer noted was that the blizzard was making no effort to sweep into the room and drown it in ice. Rather, it seemed content to just cloak the windowsill in frost and little else. Her lip curled down, further evidence that there was something off about this weather. Then again, when dealing with a Holy Grail they could be quite fearsome when weaponized. She was something of an expert on the matter. Moving forwards, she reached out to the windows and moved them across. The frames cracked as the layers of ice upon them shattered. With a silent grunt, the archer slammed the window shut, reaching up and drawing the curtains across to further keep out the cold. Then took a single step backwards and looked down at the trio once more, all of them having a thin coating of frost covering their bodies, keeping them locked in their frozen embrace. There was nothing else to be done here. There were implications to consider though, and this was quite a mixed bag. On the one hand, they didn't need to put up with complaints as they raided this home for much-needed supplies. It was always troublesome when that happened because in all likelihood she'd probably have to kill or cripple them because they were making such a fuss. Of course that would work its way back to Master somehow, and she knew he was the sort not to approve of that sort of thing. Not that she couldn't see the problem in that. It was counterproductive to kill the people you were supposed to be saving. The goal was to undo the damage to history and not make it infinitely worse. Turning around, she moved back towards the door and continued onwards, holding the torch up to keep light around the room. Hoo! Her legs locked up, her body frozen in the movements as she heard it. Almost like a gentle whistle of wind, but that wasn't it. It was the unmistakable noise of a breath being exhaled. She whirled around in an instant, her eyes snapping towards the trio once more and glaring at them, almost daring for any one of them to make a sudden movement or so much as twitch their nose. Another puff of cold air escaped the nostril of the man. Her brows creased. It had to be at least -80 degrees Celsius outside, and these people had been next to an open window. They shouldn't be alive in any sense of the word. Hey, retainer, Nobunaga called back through the house, I'm revising my earlier statement. Homeowners aren't dead. There was a pause before she got a response back. Truly, Ash was clearly as surprised as he was, but the conditions, unless, Nobunaga tilted her head as she heard the sound of wood dropping to the ground. A second later the heavy footfalls of the saber drummed out as he marched up the stairs towards her, moving along the small walkway and towards the room where she was present. Nobunaga turned to watch him enter the room. The blond man frowned as he caught sight of the trio. Green eyes narrowed slightly before he marched towards them, dropping down onto one knee and extending his right hand out to grasp the cheeks of the man and tilt his head upwards. She could tell what an examination was when she saw one. You have a cause you suspect. The storm is eerily familiar and these people, they are alive. Ash bluntly responded, the cold should have killed them and yet, he released the man's head, watching as it dropped back down and remained there. Was there anything off about the room? The window was open, Nobunaga remarked, jerking her arm in the direction of the now drawn curtains. Ash looked towards them and frowned. She quickly picked up on what he meant. The room isn't covered in ice. I noticed that as well. It is not. The storm is indeed magical in nature and these people, Ash's voice shifted, sounding somewhat distant as though his mind was elsewhere. I have encountered this before, or something close enough to this that they can be considered the same. Ariandel, yes, he confirmed with a curt tone of voice, rising up to his feet once more. They will not be moving from here anytime soon, he bluntly stated, turning around and facing the archer with a scowl. They will not move at all until this storm is lifted. For all intents and purposes they should be considered dead. He glanced back at them. So, what's wrong with them? They have lost everything, or have become listless enough to lose the will to continue onwards. Ash responded with, then his expression shifted. Or the storm has caused them to think as such. I cannot be sure but I will not rule out the possibility just yet. It is preferable to consider this as merely a created hopelessness rather than a genuine one. Well, yes, Nobunaga pointed at them. They sort of need to be alive for history's sake. She lowered her arm. So they aren't in any danger. Ash shook his head. The world of Ariandel was cold and unforgiving, but to its inhabitants it was a welcome place. He walked past her and towards the hall once more. My revulsion of the world aside, it would not kill its denizens so quickly. His footsteps jerked to a halt in the doorway, though perhaps this is little more than a guess on my part. I cannot be certain we are in a replica of Ariandel. Well, evidence points towards it or you wouldn't have brought it up, would you? No, Ash admitted with a shrug. Though Ariandel was home to more than just listless humans, stepping into the storm might be considerably more dangerous than I first considered. Some rituals use sacrifices, Nobunaga offered, causing the saber to turn around and face her. I have little intricate knowledge of magecraft, however I am aware of the richness that sacrifices offer for a ritual. They do not need to even be dead so much as drained of life. She jerked the torch towards the trio. They could have been put in a coma because this storm drains their life force or something. Hence why it can affect us. Ash frowned as he considered it, then made a small noise of understanding. A more preferable outcome to consider rather than believing Ariandel has returned. The storm will drain our magical energy the longer we remain. I'd assume so. Nobunaga shrugged. As I said before, I am no expert. Neither of us are, Ash muttered back, reaching up and cupping his chin before his lip worked its way into a scowl. We will learn nothing with guesswork. There are only two individuals who would be able to discern the true nature of this storm. The casters we came with. The archer nodded in agreement, but we don't know where either of them are. Even if we did, it's not like knowing a direction means much out there. She tapped her foot on the ground for a moment. All right, you continue with creating the fireplace while I resume looking for supplies. Jerking her head towards the trio behind them, she continued on, they don't seem to be in any immediate danger so we can ignore them for now. I'll think of a strategy in the meantime or until we get contacted. Ash looked to her for a moment before he gave a single nod of assent. Very well, you have more experience in these matters, though I will offer my insight on navigating storms such as these. They were common in Ariandel. I'd expect you to. Nobunaga replied without hesitation. I shall concoct a plan within the hour. If we are not contacted within that frame of time then we shall take that as a go-ahead for my own strategy. She paused for a moment, then shooed her hand at him. Get going. You have chairs to burn. Ash raised an eyebrow before he grunted. As you say. Turning on his heel, he walked through the hallway back the way he had come. His footfalls receded as he marched down the stairs with as much grace as he had marched up them. That was to say, none at all. Despite what the archer had said, she was privately concerned about the complete lack of communication. She knew that her master was at the very least alive, but that didn't mean anything when she now considered the comatose people behind her. The woman turned around, glancing down at them with a critical eye. If master had been caught in the storm, there might well be a chance he ended up like that. Drained enough that he would drop down and not move, but not enough that he would die. Then again, their magical energy would be hampered if that was the case, and she didn't feel any weaker than she usually did. At any rate, the Shielder girl stuck around him like Nobukatsu did to her in the early years, so she'd be more than a little surprised if something had happened to the master in the first place. The shattering sound of wood reminded her of their situation. Shaking her head, she moved around the room while raising the torch upwards, looking to see if there was anything that could be made into a useful tool. Not like she would have to deal with any complaints for thievery. He awakened with a jerk, his leg cracked against the desk with a thud that reverberated around his entire body. His head whirled around in all directions. What in the... The words flowed from his mouth in a rush, sounding more akin to a garbled mess of letters rather than any coherent sentence. Blue eyes flickered from side to side as he examined his location, then directed his attention downwards. He was in a room and dressed in a plain black t-shirt with matching colored trousers. Ritsuka let out a small noise of confusion as he stared down at his clothes, then raised his head once more and glanced at his surroundings. The bleached white walls, the singular potted plant in the corner of the room and the sleek metal bed were all familiar enough to him. He was in his bedroom in Chaldea. The boy blinked once as he opened and closed his mouth. How did what? He muttered to himself, turning about fact and directing his attention to the plain white metal desk he was currently seated in front of. Oddly enough, he didn't feel any pain from where he had bashed his knee. Something that struck him as a little peculiar, as he would usually have started hissing from clipping himself on the underside of a desk like that. His hands came up, his right reached towards his left before he stopped moving them and took notice of something. The back of his right hand was blank, his skin bereft of any of the trademark red of the command seals. Strangely enough, he didn't feel the same degree of panic that he figured he should have felt in such a situation. There was a sense of weightlessness about his body, as though his surroundings weren't quite right, but not in a malicious way. Much in the same way as he could determine whether or not he was dreaming. Ritsuka made a noise, his hand dropping down onto the table with a thud. The complete lack of sensation all but confirmed his suspicions. Though he still moved his left hand and pinched his cheek as hard as he could between his fingers to confirm it. Just to be safe, he pulled his collar forwards and glanced down at the skin around his heart. The lack of the brand over his heart dissuaded him of the alternative, not that it was going to be likely in Chaldea of all places. The loose black shirt flicked back onto his body. Okay then, I'm in a dream, Ritsuka muttered to himself, turning in his chair and slowly rising up from his seated position. Then glanced down at his feet. And I have no shoes. He paused to consider it for a moment before he shrugged. All right, at least I'm just missing my shoes and socks. He looked up, then stared at the door which led to the hallways. Or at least, it was supposed to. Whether or not it still did was an entirely different matter. Ritsuka might not have been an expert on dreams, considering he tended to forget them, but he knew enough to understand that dreams could be really wacky when they wanted to be. A single step could wind up flinging him hundreds of meters into the air, falling over could somehow leave him spinning in the sky. That sort of thing. Though this dream already felt more grounded in lucidity, considering he was still more or less aware. Recollecting his previous actions wasn't filled with the same haze as other dreams he'd experienced. Taking in a breath, he felt no oxygen enter his mouth. He walked towards the door and reached for the button. Pressing his index finger on the exit and watching as the door silently slid to the side. Ritsuka stuck his head through the entrance, his neck shifting from side to side as he scanned the new room. Yep, that tracks, he stated in a hushed voice as he stepped through, the door closing behind him without making a sound once again. Considering he had gone from his room to the command room, Ritsuka would say that it was safe to state that the normal layout of Chaldea had been altered in his mind. Though quite why he was here, he couldn't say. Last he recalled was the blizzard. He'd nearly been knocked down, and then the next thing he knew he was here of all places, and that was that. No, that wasn't quite it. There had been someone else there, Ritsuka was sure about that. Though he hadn't gotten a look at their face, he was certain that there had been another person in the storm with him at the time. He hadn't recognized the voice at all, but he was sure that whoever they were, they had saved him. It didn't explain why he was now here though. He moved through the command room, walking closer to the front desk and peeking over the blue screens. Despite them being active, there was little in the way of writing upon them. Though there were pictures displayed on them. Some he recognized. Wait a second, he muttered out, walking closer to the desk where Romani would usually situate himself and then staring at the glowing blue screen with sudden intensity, his hands pressing against the desktop. He recognized these pictures, each one that would flash across without any rhyme or reason to them. Ritska knew them, it was difficult not to, considering he had experienced them. These were cut-out pictures of his memories. That time just before Elizabeth started singing in Rome and the immediate aftermath of all their expressions warped in pain and anguish. That time they were in Rome and Ash came barreling out of that house to set it on fire while screaming at the top of his lungs. What the? Ritska reached out towards the screen, then stopped, his fingers just shy of touching the latest image. The peaceful expression of Mash filled the monitor, contradicted by the rubble currently burying her beneath it. His hand wrapped firmly around her own. Ritska's brows creased as he took a single step backwards. Ah, so you made it here then. The voice was familiar, eerily so, and spoke with an intellectual capacity he didn't recognize. Ritska whirled around, facing the direction of the voice and moving himself back far enough that he was pressed against the desk. His expression shifted through varying emotions before it landed on pensive. I seem to have caught you somewhat unprepared. The voice continued on, the figure moving forwards with their hands behind their back. The pace of their movements were slow and methodical, as if they were making a show out of walking, but not in the extravagant sense. Rather, as though they were emphasizing each step as being one of importance. Though, that is hardly a surprise. They stood at Ritska's exact height. Pale white hair clashed with Ritska's dark black, golden eyes clashed with his bright blue orbs. Despite the physical appearance, their clothing was an exact match to Ritska's own. A simple black t-shirt and trousers. The face was the strangest part of it though. Considering it was his own, though, the expression looked virtually alien. The lips pulled into a thin line, the attentiveness of the eyes and the straightened-out posture. His mirror match stopped walking as they came upon his right side, then twisted their body to face him completely. Ritska moved back once more, putting some distance between himself and his doppelganger. I assure you, my intentions are not violent. His mirror match responded to him, the eyes flickered away from him and towards the screens. Ritska felt a little exposed with how this person was just glancing at his memories, leaning forwards to focus on one in particular. Even if they were, there is little hope you could escape me in this place. Even if you are the owner. That's not all that comforting. Ritska snarked back as he glanced around. Sure enough, the walls were completely bereft of anything that could be considered an escape route. Even the window to observe Chaldeas had been removed and replaced with a metal barrier. I spoke merely the facts of the situation. The other Ritska responded back without shifting his attention in the least. The voice lacked any sort of warmth. It was cold and calculating, but at the same time there was something about the words which struck a chord with Ritska. It was the same sort of tone that a teacher would use with a student. The whole, I know better than you, vibe that the other Ritska was giving off was akin to a signal flare. You should be comforted in the fact that I have instead approached you with the objective of speaking rather than resorting to such barbaric tactics. The tinge in the words emphasized how little the other him cared for the idea. Leaning back and uncrossing his arms from behind his back, turning on his heel, he faced Ritska. Is approaching you with an open hand for dialogue not something you should be thankful for? Yeah, Ritska mumbled back after a moment, glancing around the room and then back to himself. And you are? The white-haired youth raised an eyebrow at him, though his expression remained unchanged. Is it not customary to introduce yourself before you demand the name of another? Despite your common heritage, I doubt you were raised without manners. Ritska made a face. Given that you're currently walking around looking like me, he pointed at the screen, and you're staring at my memories like it's a straight-to-video movie, I'd assume you already know who I am. The master composed himself slightly, shifting on his feet and bringing himself up. But if you insist, I'm Ritska Fujimaru. Was that so difficult? The white-haired copy responded with, though your suspicion is rather surprising, given that I did just save your life from certain doom. For the first time, a frown worked its way onto the boy's face. Does that not entitle me to some level of trust? I'm thankful for you saving me. Ritska bowed his head respectfully, his words genuine. Really, I am. But walking around with my face and looking through my private moments isn't something I'd let someone do after meeting them once. Saving my life or not. The lip of his copy twitched upwards. Yes, I believe that would be a considerable strain upon a show of good faith, then flattened itself out once more. Though I suppose I should introduce myself to you. He raised his hand up, gesturing to his chest. I am Castor. As for why I am speaking with you, I am here to offer a deal. Singularity 4, Church of the Frozen Embrace. And London starts off with a bang. Already out of the gate with wild theories, cabin fever groups and odd mysteries. I hope you're ready for a wild ride. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.